Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 623 for February 9th, 2025, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us this week, everybody. We have a really fun show in store.
I can't wait.
Brendan and I are going to do a deep dive into my favorite new genre on YouTube.
Oh, no, we're not doing that.
Watching everyone react to the wild robot.
It's a growing epidemic, and I told you about this offline, JD. If you want to start a profitable YouTube channel, you just got to do reaction videos, apparently.
Yeah. I mean, I would love to do a commentary sometime. I've thought about it for a while now, and given where we're at now with the wild robot, maybe we can do some sort of commentary, watch along sort of thing.
Like a little riff tracks or something like that, but it'll just be mostly JD tears for over half of it.
Yeah, probably would be something like that. I will say, though, I have absolutely loved this epidemic. I have watched no less than a dozen of these videos of people live watching the wild robot, reacting to it. And because the film is so deeply emotional, people have struggled to talk through the episode. They just find themselves overwhelmed. And it's so great to see. I have found my people. There
are many of them. Like I found a few of them that I enjoy watching from various channels. I can't remember the names of these specific channels off the top of my head, but there are some where I was watching of people enjoying a movie like E.T. for the very first time and catching their live actions or their live reactions on camera. It's like I said, it's a growing epidemic. It's not necessarily a bad epidemic. There's a lot of it out there.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the wild robot reaction videos that I've seen anyway, because admittedly, I don't watch a lot of those kinds of videos.
Yeah.
Generally, I feel like the reaction video, and I'm speaking in very broad strokes here, when you're talking about trailers, for example, things of that nature, a lot of it seems clickbaity to me. Like it feels disingenuous. We're overreacting to something.
It seems kind of forced, kind of
seems forced.
Like there's actually like a performative aspect to it, but there is something different about reacting to a full movie because that's a real reaction that people can sometimes have to those things.
Well, and that's the thing. Unless these are professional actors that are doing these videos, and I don't think that's the case at all. Admittedly, I've watched, like I said, at least a dozen of these. I don't know any of these individuals. I've never seen their channels before. I've only been exposed to them because of this video. But I'm going to, assume here safely, I think, that they're not professional actors. And they're on camera emotionally unraveling during the wild robot. That's something that can only happen organically. You're invested in the film. You're loving the characters. You're emotionally attached to what the messaging of the film is. And the film is obviously really great. I would argue it's one of the very best films of the year. And to see them organically, even if maybe they started out the video doing some sort of performance, to your point a moment ago, that pretty quickly eviscerates and evaporates. And you just see them kind of fall into the rhythm of the film. So in that context, it is fascinating.
Yeah. How disappointed would you be, though, if you found out all of them were just failed actors who moved to LA who just decided to make a YouTube channel as their secondary form of life?
That could be part of it. That could certainly be part of it. I don't know. Because generally, again, going back to something like the trailer reactions, you can tell they're putting on a performance most of the time. They are overreacting because that's interesting, I guess. If you just sat there stoically and you didn't make any sort of movement that would most likely make for a
You might as well just be
video. No one's
watching
gonna
the
watch.
trailer yourself, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like nobody, who cares?
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to overreact to create engagement in the video. I totally get it. But like when you're watching a movie that's full length, I think that it's hard to perform for that long, I think.
Yeah.
I like the full length reaction videos to like when you're watching along with someone that's a little bit more organic. I'm extrapolating because I don't really watch those videos all that much, but I could see why that is.
Absolutely. Which is maybe why a commentary will be a good idea for us sometime. But we've got to pick a ridiculous movie, something that's really fun for us to just talk over.
Yeah, I think, and the difference between you and I, like I wouldn't want to do a reaction video. I think seeing our reaction in the moment is going to be a part of it. That's always going to be a part of it. But I would much rather do a commentary where we're having an actual discussion as the film goes, talking about what works, what doesn't, how we engage with the film.
Yeah, we like words on this show.
Yeah, it'll be more podcasty, more like an actual commentary, like on like how they used to do on the Blu-ray. When the Blu-rays would come out, they'd have the directors commentating over it.
Some of those are the best.
It'd be more like that, like having a conversation versus you just sitting there watching me react. I feel like that would be more interesting. That's how I would approach it. But
I think that's fair. I think I'd be in the same ballpark as you as well.
But because another one I would really love to do, I mean, we can certainly do something emotional like The Wild Robot or First Man, Midnight Special, if people want to see me just completely melt on camera. But I think in terms of the conversation aspect, doing Interstellar with you would be, I think, really compelling.
It would be compelling, but we might lose half our fan base.
Maybe, but I think we'd be able to explain in detail, especially if people are watching it at home with us, where, you know, we can in detail, like in real time, talk about why we react to that film the way we do.
I would try to be less cynical about it in the moment. That movie does make me admittedly a bit cynical, maybe more so than I would care to admit.
It would be a bipolar experience. There's no
would
doubt
be.
about that.
It would be. It would be like, oh my gosh, this is one of the most beautiful scenes of the past decade. Then it would transition a few minutes later to be like, I hate that line of dialogue so much. It's so bad.
Yeah, exactly. But that's why it would be a fun episode. I think people would enjoy it because of that.
It's like, I don't know what's reality anymore.
If you want to hear Brendan and I do a commentary, let us know. Leave a comment below. Reach out to us on social media because we would love to set that up if there's enough people interested. I've been wanting to do it for years now, so let us know. Let us know if that's something you want us to do. For real, though, on this episode, we are going to finally do our David Lynch retrospective. We were supposed to do this last week, and then Emilio Perez decided to have themselves a week. And we pivoted last week. Obviously, we brought Ryan McQuaid back. We had to talk a little bit more about the Emilio Perez controversies.
Yeah, we joked, sorry to cut you off, but we joked that we had to prepare ourselves in case it was going to happen a third week in a row. It didn't. Thankfully, it didn't quite happen.
Yeah.
There's more we could talk about, though. There were a few additional updates, maybe that don't necessarily warrant a full episode once again.
No.
But we were preparing ourselves for the worst. I think we had to in this case.
We were, and Monday and Tuesday did not slow down all that much. And then thankfully it did. And the rest of the week played out, you know, rather normal, at least given what award season is. You know, it's still a little chaotic, but we decided to stick with David Lynch this week. However, before we get to David Lynch, we are going to continue to talk about award season here a little bit. I do want to note, though, there were trailers for Jurassic World Rebirth, Fantastic Four First Steps. We are going to talk about those as well, but we're either going to do that for bonus content this week or move that to next week's show. As we are recording this, the Super Bowl is tonight.
Yes.
And we are expecting more trailers. So we decided it made more sense to group them all together. So we'll do Jurassic World Rebirth, Fantastic Four, whatever else we get tonight. We'll group them all together, and we'll do that either next week or for bonus content later on this week. We'll figure that out soon enough, but stay
you mentioned,
on the lookout for that.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the Super Bowl, which is tonight as we're recording this. I just noticed our color scheme that we have going online here, visually speaking, kind of mirrors the two teams that are playing against each other. We didn't intend it to be that way.
No.
But given the way that we're dressed, I feel like it seems to suggest which team we're pulling for of the two.
Yeah, I definitely did not think about that as I was getting prepared here. I just, put on one of my InSession Film t-shirts, and I got my coffee and decided to jump on here. But generally, I am rooting for the team that is playing the Chiefs. That's where I stand.
Yep, that's where the green is.
I live to Ryan McQuaid, who I know is a Chiefs head and wants the Chiefs to win. But
I just think the Eagles are a better team this year.
Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see. I mean, as this episode goes out, the Super Bowl is already over. So either boo Chiefs, they won again, or yay, Eagles won. We'll see which one, and I'll edit out whatever happened.
You're going to keep both of them in there anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Seems like too much work.
Right. Before we get to David Lynch, let's quickly talk about the award season, because this last weekend a lot happened.
Yeah,
where we had the Critics' Choice Awards, PGA and DGA happened over the weekend as well. So we'll quickly talk about where things stand currently with award season. Let's start with Critics' Choice. Brennan, any thoughts on this year's Critics' Choice Award?
I feel like the running theme. Well, I think the running theme between our reaction to the Critics' Choice Awards as well as DGA and PGA are going to lead to the exact same outcome. I have no idea what's going to happen on Oscar night now. I have no idea. But it seems like the narrative is changing, because now the attention is back on Anora. It was on Anora for quite some time, and then it wasn't for quite some time. And now it's back. It was kind of this weird pendulum effect, because Anora was a huge success. We might, talk about John M. Chu for Wicked a little bit, which is maybe the most ridiculous award of the night. Not even surprising, the most ridiculous, I feel like. But it's interesting to see a movie like Anora, which almost seemed to be getting shut out, kind of re-enter the conversation a little bit, as if it never left. Maybe it never did leave, and people were just mistakenly assuming that it was being buried by the likes of Emilia Perez and The Brutalist. And to be fair, I still think there is attention for those films when we get to Oscar night. I don't necessarily think the pendulum has shifted 100% the other way, but it does go back to what we've said, that there does seem to be this confusing lack of consensus among many different demographics, whether it be audiences and critics alike, with regard to all of these films. So that was the biggest takeaway I took from not just the Critics' Choice Awards, but that also tailors into the DGA and PGA as well. Just seeing Anora really come through.
Yeah, I think I saw a stat that this is the first year since 2002 where we had different director winners for Globes, Critics' Choice, and DGA.
Yeah.
Which I think is really exciting. And I believe in that same year, BAFTA had a different winner as well. It was Polanski that year, I believe, and then he went on to win the Oscar. So there were 4 different winners for those particular awards. And this year could end up providing a very similar thing, which could be really exciting. So I do hope, simply for the chaos of it all, that BAFTA does continue that trend. It gives us a different winner for director, just to make it all the more interesting. You are right that Anora is very much back in the race in a big, big way, probably the front runner as it stands right now. And I do want to say, I want to shout out Shadon Larkey, our awards editor over at InSessionFilm.com, because for the longest time now, she recently updated her predictions. Last week, they did change a little bit. But up until the last week or so, Shadon had Anora winning Best Picture for the longest time. So she has always been on that specifically, and which I do think is really impressive. Now, again,
good for her.
Recently updated it like in the last week or so, because Anora was a little sluggish recently in terms of some of these recent awards. And even all the way through Critics' Choice, it was interesting because it didn't win anything other than Best Picture, which is crazy. And I do want to say that even when it comes to the Oscars, could that same thing happen again? I do see a world where maybe that does happen. And given the preferential ballot, how it works, I do think it is very possible because the controversies, we talked about that last week with Amelia Perez. A lot of people may not vote for it, and it could be all the way down the ballot for a lot of people. The Brutalist and how they feel, you could see that happening for them as well. So Anora, if it just continually sits at that 2-3 spot for a lot of people, if not number one, it could end up stealing Best Picture in that way. And then what if Brady Corbet wins director? What if The Substance steals original screenplay away from Sean Baker? I do think those options are also possible at the Oscars. And how interesting would it be?
I think you're right.
Out again.
I think the Oscars are going to represent exactly what this year has been as far as the awards race is concerned, and that it's all over the place. So I think just given how the preferential ballot works, and I'm glad you brought that up, I think it's going to be pretty evenly distributed. It's not like in past years where you may have two films that just seem to represent the big awards simultaneously. This is not like a Parasite situation, right? Where everyone's gravitating to a film or two that just seem to have this type of momentum that can't be matched by other nominees. In many ways, I think the weird discombobulated awards race here just represents how different all of these films are from each other and how they're catering to different audiences and demographics, because not all the same voting bodies are the same and they have very different things. Maybe some of these other films in past years that were more universally loved is because they had more of that transferable love between different audiences. They were more accessible in that way. All of these movies this year for 2024 specifically are very different from each other, which actually makes it kind of fascinating. So perhaps that's a reflection of that as well. But I do think you're right. I think when we get to Oscar night, we're going to see things sort of distributed in that way, just given how it works. We've often talked about how in a race that's similar to this, a lot of times the movie that ends up winning Best Picture is the one that's kind of in that like 4-3 rank spot because it just happens to have the closest universal love, right? And perhaps Anora is that movie this year. That is the one that's kind of sitting and straddling that line most consistently. So I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being Anora that goes on to win, just given the fact that it may not be the most loved universally, but it's also not the most hated universally. It's kind of in that nice, comfortable middle ground.
It is, and I do think it'll be a great winner if and when it does go on to win the Oscar for Best Picture. I know there's been some debate about this, but I really like Anora a lot. I think it's a great film.
It's my favorite of the Best Picture nominees. I'm going to say that.
Yes.
And I get why there is some pushback now, because there is more of a directorial edge to movies like The Brutalist and Nickel Boys, for instance, right? So I can understand maybe where that pushback is coming from, but I loved Anora. I thought that was a really, really fun movie that also just absolutely sticks the landing.
It does stick the landing. I do agree. I really like it a lot. Now, obviously, I would go with Nickel Boys for Best Picture, but Nickel Boys has absolutely no shot to win that award. In reality, it is simply lucky to be along for the ride. The Brutalist is the film that is still very much a contender and one that I would vote for if I had a pick with the Academy. But Anora is a really great winner. Of the nominees, that probably sits at 4 or 5 for me, because I would also have Dune Part 2. Well, Dune Part 2 is nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars.
It is,
right?
It is.
So, I would go with The Brutalist. I would go with Nickel Boys. Dune Part 2 I have slightly above Anora, but I really like Anora a lot. And I would have absolutely no qualms at all if it ended up winning Best Picture. I am really curious, though, how what its path is going to be when it comes to the Oscars, as we're talking about here. And regarding CCA, if that is indicative of anything when it comes to Oscars night, because Critics' Choice does get a lot of grief. And in a lot of ways, I think rightfully so. And not because it's an awards body that's trying to predict the Oscars. I don't really get all caught up in all of that.
Yeah.
As much as I think what is nominated and what is awarded, there's a disparity there between the rest of the body and what I vote for or what I tend to nominate.
Yeah, you're definitely your own person.
I stick out like a sore thumb because most of what won, especially, I did not vote for. And even in terms of the nominees, a lot of what I tried to nominate ended up not getting nominated. So and it's not just me. A lot of our peers that we talked to quite a lot voted similarly to what I did as well. Yeah. But there's a contingent of the Critics' Choice body that has very different tastes in film from me. And boy, was that demonstrated this year, maybe more than any other year, because up until Nora winning Best Picture, a lot of the winners here just left a lot to be desired. Now, I will say when it comes to the acting categories, I don't have much of an issue there. Adrian Brody, I think, is really, really great. He's likely going to win the Oscar there.
They look like the ones that are going to end up winning the Oscar.
Those are the four that are likely going to win. And, you know, I said this on social media over the weekend as well, because there's been a lot of pushback with Kieran Culkin. And I think the only reason this exists is because of what, Brendan?
No, because he's the favorite.
Because we've turned art into sports. That's exactly why.
I wasn't going to say it that way because that's your saying. You've patented that saying right now. I leave the sports analogy to you.
well, yeah. I mean, that's exactly what we've done. If Kieran Culkin was not sweeping Best Supporting Actor all year, no one would care. No one would push back. It's a really great performance in a really good movie. Yeah. Now, in all transparency, did I vote for Kieran Culkin to win? No, I did not. Of the crop for CCA this year, I would have gone with Yura Borisov or Clarence Macklin. Those are my 1 and 2.
Same with me. Yeah.
I would have Culkin probably 3 or maybe 4 because I really like Guy Pearce as well. But I think it's a really good performance that I think is deserving as well. Like I have no problem with him winning that award.
Yeah, I don't either. In fact, when we did our awards, I don't know if I quite had Kieran Culkin in my 5, but I still love the performance, so I have no issue with this. I'm not one of those people that turns art into sports in this antagonistic way. Now, I would be doing that if, let's say, Edward Norton were the one sweeping this award.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like Edward Norton. And I think the reason we would flip that switch a little bit is because at that point, it becomes a little bit of that Jamie Lee Curtis, Everything Everywhere All at Once thing, where that's a performance that's just clearly not deserving to probably be even nominated, let alone win the award. And nothing against Edward Norton. I think he's perfectly fine in A Complete Unknown, but that's not a Best Supporting Actor performance, in my opinion.
It's not. No. I can name Culkin, probably,
I think is...
Yeah, I think I can name 20 performances that Edward Norton has given that I like more than A Complete Unknown.
And I could certainly name 20 to 30 supporting actor performances this year I would rank above.
Oh, absolutely.
So him winning, but he's not really in contention. So thankfully,
he's not. No,
not much of an issue. Him being invited to the party, fine. Okay, that's fine because Kieran Culkin is on his way to winning that Oscar. But that is a performance I really, really like. I would not put Culkin in the same category as Jamie Lee Curtis at all. I'm
with you. I agree.
I think that's a really good performance. And Zoe Saldana on her way to winning an Oscar, as we talked about last week as well.
Yeah, and honestly, the one objectively great thing in Emilia Perez for me is Zoe Saldana's performance.
Yeah, for sure. John M. Chu winning director. What are we doing? What are we doing?
This gets into something you mentioned earlier that I think is a very fair point, and maybe something we don't really consider all that much given the specific colleagues within Critics' Choice that we often network with, right? Because the Critics' Choice body is big. And there are a lot of people that maybe translate over to, let's say, more of the YouTube critic sphere than those that maybe work in more of the publications, the Oscar predictions, the podcast side of things. And tastes vary, right? There are very different tastes, very different types of audiences that gravitate towards different things. And maybe in this case, it was just a bigger body that happened to gravitate more towards Wicked that overpowered people like us in our specific circle, right? That's the only explanation I can have, because otherwise I think Wicked is basically a directionless movie. I do not agree with this choice at all. I find it baffling, but that's the only explanation as to maybe why I think something like this could have happened.
Yeah. Now, before I get into it, because I do agree with a lot of what you're saying, I want to walk back something I said a moment ago. Okay. Where I said a lot of the winners, like kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. That's not entirely true. In fact, that's not true really at all. It really comes down to two. Yeah.
But those two just left such a big taste that almost seemed like the entire ceremony left a bad taste in your mouth, right?
Exactly. Because the Wild Robot wins animation. Yes. Loved that. Absolutely loved that.
Great pick. Great pick.
Dune wins visual effects. Incredible winner there. I have no problem with that. The Substance wins best hair and makeup. That makes a lot of sense. Right?
Absolutely.
Challengers winning editing, I think, is interesting because that's not a film up for contention for director or winning best picture, yet it wins best editing, a category that is often looked at as a precursor for director and picture. And Challengers,
so
again,
weird.
That's the fun of the CCA this year, is the winners were simply all over the place. But an inspired pick for editing, I think. I don't have an issue with that at all.
No, I'm with you.
Jaron Blanchky wins for Nosferatu for cinematography. Love that. Conclave adapted screenplay wouldn't have been my pick, but that's fine. The writing,
the love going here and there and here and there and here and there. It's
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the memifying of Conclave really comes down to the screenplay and the writing of those characters and a lot of the gossiping that takes place in that film.
Sure.
The Substance stealing original screenplay, again, wouldn't have been my pick, but I do find it inspired. I have no problem with that as well. So, a lot of these winners, I don't mind at all, to be clear, to walk back my comments from a moment ago. However, Deadpool and Wolverine for best comedy, deeply embarrassing. There's no other way around it. That is a deeply embarrassing pick. I'm sorry. Absolutely awful.
I agree.
And then John M2 for director, again, I completely agree with you. And it's similarly to what we just talked about with Edward Norton a moment ago. I can probably think of 50 other directors that deserve that award more than John M2 for Wicked. And I could probably do it off the cuff here. That film is directionless in a lot of ways. The reason that film succeeds is because the floor is already very high because the material is great.
Yeah.
The material is really, really good.
And it had the right cast. The right cast to represent that material. Yeah.
The music is done wonderfully. You would have had to really go out of your way to completely botch that material. It is really, really fantastic. And honestly, splitting them up, probably a good call because it allows you to really let that material breathe. So I will give them credit there. But as far as the actual direction of that film goes, it is middling at best. It's not very good.
I'm with you.
Not very good. And yet, he is not only nominated for Best Director here, but then goes on to win over Brady Corbet, or as we come to see with Best Picture, Sean Baker with Anora as well. I just don't understand the mentality there. I don't get it. I don't get it.
With the preferential ballot at the Oscars, it's really hard to, I guess, rightfully accuse the Academy of trying to deviate their votes up to make sure everything gets well represented in some way. Because it's just impossible to make that happen. It's hard to make that agenda seem like a genuine thing, right? But I'm almost hard pressed to say that the evenly split disparity of votes here and winners for the Critics' Choice almost seems like they're just trying to give every movie some type of award. That's kind of how it feels here. It feels like Wicked had no chance of winning anything else, so we have to at least represent it in some way to at least suggest, we still know the movie exists and it's still a play. So let's give it something.
And I wonder how conscious that is for a lot of voters, because
Yeah, I don't know.
again, in transparency, when I was voting for my awards, that was not a thought in my mind at all. Like, I was simply voting for what I think was the best. And
Yeah, what deserved it.
again, I went with Nickel Boys for Best Picture. Knew it wasn't going to win, but that's where my vote went anyway. I went with, I think, Brady Corbet for director, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have my lineup in front of me. I'm trying to go off memory here, but I think that's where, like, I just went with what I thought was the best in each category.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, and to your point, maybe a lot of people do vote that way, and that's why these winners end up the way they are. But I do wonder if, again, flipping that coin back to my side for a second, that could also explain why something like Challengers wins for editing, because that film is really well edited. It's really fun. It's great. And you're voting for Challengers because it is really well edited, and not because you're also voting for Honora for Best Picture, or Sean Baker for director. You know what I mean?
That's where I like the Critics' Choice Awards, when we see things that win, because in some categories, like an editing or maybe something else that's technically related, something that's technical in a way, it does feel like there's a recognition that the specific technical merit itself is the thing that is getting recognized. Because a movie like Challengers is not really up for anything else, sadly. Maybe, I mean, in certain categories, maybe in certain award circles, you may see it represented for Best Original Score or editing or something like that. So this at least is evidence that critics are recognizing that that movie has really good editing. The editing is worth talking about, even if the movie itself maybe isn't. It's a nice way to separate the specific art within the art, right? So like that was neat evidence to see.
Yeah, they also went with score for Challengers as well, which was great to see, because that's a score not nominated for an Oscar.
Right.
A fact that blows my mind as well. I just will never understand that mentality at all.
I don't get it.
And I do not get the love for Amelia Perez. I don't need to go into that a whole lot. We've talked about that a lot over the last few weeks, especially. I do think it's interesting. People in the room were talking about how during Best Song, when El Mel came out, it was crickets. Not a peep, no applause, nothing. Just Amelia Perez, when it was brought up, it was just it seemed awkward in the room. And
if I remember the Academy and I saw that reaction, my first thought would be, well, I guess we made a good call not having these nominees performed at the Oscars now. Instead, let's just have it be Wicked. Let's just open with Wicked, which is, again, the silliest thing. But I feel like that's just evidence as to why these are not even going to be performed. It's such a weak year for Best Original Song.
Oh, my gosh. Well, and then Kiss the Sky. Again, this somewhat circles back to what we opened the show with in terms of these reactions. Kiss the Sky and The Wild Robot, I don't think is a throwaway nomination by any stretch of the imagination. I think the way that song is utilized in the film is quite brilliant. And you can almost pinpoint in every single one of those reaction watch-alongs with The Wild Robot, you can almost pinpoint exactly when the emotion starts to come from everybody in those videos. It's during that sequence when that song kicks in.
It's basically DreamWorks Animation's version of When She Loved Me from Toy Story 2, the Sarah McLachlan song. Yeah, it's more or less the equivalent of that.
It's exactly. I totally agree. It's really, really fantastic. That not getting in for an Oscar. Again, it just goes to show that the music branch for the Academy, they don't care at all. Like, they don't treat the Oscars seriously in any way. In any way. It's a joke. It's an utter joke, both of those music categories at the Oscars. Which, goes on to say, like, I think we all kind of anticipated El Mal would win for Best Song here.
Yeah.
I do kind of wonder, though, given how the room reacted to Amelia Perez throughout the night, if all of these controversies came out before voting, because we were already done. We had voted long before any of these controversies came to light. I kind of wonder if the night would have played out differently, at least for Amelia Perez. It's possible. It's
a good
certainly
question.
possible if the room and how they reacted is indicative to the larger body, which might not be the case, but if it is, I think the ceremony would have played out a little differently. Possibly, anyway.
It's a good question. It really is, because there is so much that plays into this that is related to gossip, right? Gossip has a real, sadly, a real influence on the way that these things go, and
which is why Conclave should be winning
best documentary
all the awards. like it certainly looks like Adora is on its way to winning Best Picture, but I will say, I still think Conclave should win because that film is representative of this award season's chaos.
I'm not even kidding. You could do a shot-for-shot remake of Conclave with the exact same script, just replace the characters with members of the actual Academy, and it's the exact same movie.
The same. Yeah, same movie. Yeah. I completely agree. I think that's why it should go on to win Best Picture, but kind of circling away from CCA, but just to quickly talk about DGA and PGA, because if I'm not mistaken, the voting for those did occur after some of these controversies came to light.
I think so.
Did that influence help Sean Baker and Honora in the process? Would Emilio Perez have won? Would Jacques Audiard have taken home DGA if none of that happened? I don't know.
I think the reason why
I'm wondering.
Well, I think the reason why it's a great question to ask is that it goes back to what we said earlier about a movie like Honora being this nice, almost comfortable middle ground, right? Of a movie that is very well loved, but maybe not hated like other movies in this list of nominees, essentially. Because if, let's say, like if DGA awarded The Brutalist instead, I think that might actually suggest a different thing. But because a movie like Honora is the one that seemed to come out on top, I think is the one that just seems to have the less attention to it. I feel like in many ways, we still see Variety, for instance, I guess predicting a complete unknown to win Best Picture, which is absolutely ridiculous.
Okay.
But I
guess.
I think their reasoning is why a lot of people are now picking Honora. So I think the critical reasoning on their side, I don't think is necessarily wrong. I think they're just attaching it to the wrong movie.
The analysis makes sense. They just went with the wrong film.
Yeah. But I think Honora winning, I think, is maybe where these recent controversies are maybe something to consider. But if it were a different movie taking it on, then maybe it might be a different story. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to the Academy, or the Oscars themselves, right? Because everybody votes on the winners. So when it comes to director, you do have to wonder how much weight is there for Brady Corbet in that conversation. There might be more willing to vote for him that loved his direction more when you include the entire body of the Academy. Yeah, I think that's part of it. And also, with DGA, Corley Forja was not nominated, but she is nominated for the Oscar.
Yeah.
Does she have a legit chance as well?
I think she does.
I do kind of wonder, and I think she does as well. I think when it comes to the actual Oscar, we'll never know, but I do kind of wonder how close the voting will be. It might be really tight.
I think it will.
That could be a really interesting race.
Yeah, I can see
and
it going
probably
either way.
is. Going back to, again, what we said earlier, we had different winners across the board this whole season so far. So it probably is a very tight race.
Watch, somehow Ramel Ross wins Best Director at the Oscars, even though he's not nominated. But he somehow wins anyway. They just write his name in.
Just write his name in. But speaking of, he does win First Time Feature, which I was very excited about. I mean, with DGA and PGA, the big thing for me was as long as Ross or Payal Kapadia won for feature, which likely was going to happen, I would have been thrilled. That's all I needed to make me happy. And I was really, really glad to see that Ramel Ross at least won for First Time Feature. But I will die on the hill that the conversation for Best Director in 2024, it begins and ends with Ramel Ross. He should be sweeping across the board.
So should Jomo Frey for cinematography.
And Jomo Frey for cinematography.
Actually, heck, Jomo Frey should also
be sweeping all season.
Jomo Frey should also be nominated for Best Supporting Actor. as we talked about, because the camera is it's literally a performance. It's an acting performance. It's that good.
I know. We talked about Steven Soderbergh and Presence. This is wholly conspiracy theory here.
Oh,
but what if Soderbergh, because you remember that film got pushed back. What if he caught wind of Nickel Boys and what Ramel Ross was doing and pushed his film back to give?
It's like, I don't have a chance.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you don't want to necessarily compare yourself to that, and you let Nickel Boys kind of take the spotlight there, especially because they were going to have some awards push. And Presence was never going to be in the awards conversation. Maybe they pushed it back just to give them the spotlight. And if so,
if so, that'd be nice of him. That'd be nice of him.
And there's probably no truth to that, but I'm going to believe that that's true because Soderbergh is that guy.
Soderbergh's he's a good dude.
Good dude.
Yeah.
I love it.
I love how we had this whole awards conversation and the thesis we end on, Steven Soderbergh's a good dude.
We all knew that's how we were going to end this. It's right there.
Should be the end for every segment. Somehow we got to tie it back to how Steven Soderbergh is just a good dude.
Exactly. Always land on Soderbergh. That is the thing there.
Absolutely.
Okay, so any final thoughts? PGA, DGA, Critics' Choice.
No, I think we said what we needed to say. I am glad that you brought up Ramel Ross, though. That was going to be my closing thought, that at least his name got recognized in some way, as it should be. It should be heavier and more so, but I'm excited to see what he has next. And I think he's got a Best Director nomination, maybe even win somewhere in his future. It's got to happen. It absolutely does.
Yeah, I completely agree. They do need to make up for this. My last final thought on this, since Best Picture seems to be solidified, and I think we can all agree that at this point, of course, come Oscar night, I might be eating crow here. It does seem as if Emilia Perez might be a little dead in the water, especially since voting is about to begin. All these controversies took place before voting has begun, the final voting, that is, for the Academy.
Yeah, and obviously the Academy's aware of it. Yeah, the Academy's aware of it now because they are making changes to the ceremony because of this.
Because of all of this.
Yeah,
exactly. And it does seem, I know we questioned it on last week's show, but it does seem as if Carlos Sofia Gasson is not going to be there. At least that's what has been suggested. So with that out of the way, it does seem as if Nora, maybe the Brutalist, Conclave, it's probably going to come down to those three, which is exciting. So my last final thought is honestly on animation, because The Wild Robot wins Critics' Choice. It also wins for PGA as well. So there is some momentum. As we are talking here, I did not look it up this morning. Did it win the Annie last night, or did Flo win the Annie? Do you know?
That's a great question. I do not know.
Because all of this was unfolding at 1 a.m. Eastern time, and in all transparency, I fell asleep before the Annies were concluded. I could not stay awake.
Best feature went to The Wild Robot.
Okay, so The Wild Robot wins the Annie as well.
Best independent feature goes to Flo.
Of course it does.
Yeah.
So
and those are two separate categories. So so the list of nominees for Best Feature, there's no crossover between that and Best Independent Feature. So independent features where you had movies like Chicken for Linda or Look Back or Mars Express or Memoir of a Snail, whereas Best Feature included the likes of Wild Robot, Kung Fu Panda 4, Inside Out 2, Wallace and Gromit. So in many ways, this just makes it more confusing, right?
Yeah. Honestly, it does. Well, and I'm glad that you brought that distinction, because I wanted to bring up the Annie Awards to be like, well, I don't know who won between the two of them, but they both ended up winning. And Flo also won for writing at the Annie Awards. That I did know. That was released before I fell asleep, so that's why I was curious if Flo ended up winning Best Feature, but I forgot they do kind of split those up a little bit. Yeah. So, that's been a tight race. And then we have the BAFTAs coming up. I don't know what that's going to look like. But The Wild Robot did gain some momentum this weekend because it won PGA and Critics' Choice as well. Yeah. So, I don't know. The Oscar for Best Animation this year is going to be really interesting. Even with the momentum the Royal Robot had this weekend, I don't think they've pulled away.
Oh
They haven't
no,
pulled away.
I think like if Flo wins this award on Oscar night, I won't be surprised.
I won't either. I don't think anyone would be like. It honestly feels like a toss up. It could go either way.
Honestly, like if you were to ask me right now, just given my hunch and how this evidence looks, what I think the Academy is going to go for on Oscar night, or what the winner is going to be Oscar night, rather, I think my prediction might be Flo at this point. Just maybe given the history of how that award has been playing out at the Oscars, it seems to be more geared towards not just the artful ones, but the ones that are a bit distant from the more commercialized production companies. I feel like that's why we saw movies like The Boy and the Heron one, or the Spider-Verse movies being more represented. I feel like there is more of a distinction happening between the DreamWorkses of the world, or the Disneys of the world, or the Pixars of the world. I feel like that's shifting just a little bit, and maybe Flo carries that same narrative.
No, I mean, I think that's spot on. That's exactly what I was going to say. Is we saw Hayao Miyazaki win for The Boy and the Heron, and that went up against Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, this beloved animated film that was a success financially and critically, and in a lot of ways was a front runner all season. But The Boy and the Heron comes along and ends up winning the Oscar, which is very exciting for Hayao Miyazaki and company. So I do see that perhaps happening again. Like I think that award at this point is a coin toss.
It is,
And obviously my vote would slightly go to The Wild Robot, but I love both of them. I'm going to be ecstatic either way. My only thing, and maybe this will be my last thought. I noted this on social media as well. If Chris Bowers somehow wins score, I think I will fall apart. I might die on the spot. Who knows? Like, I think I will just completely melt.
Don't do that. I can't look for a new co-host.
Daniel Blumberg. I tell you what, I'm gonna fall apart if that happens, though. Oh my god, that score! I love it so much.
It's great. It's a great score.
All right, Brennan, let's talk about September 5.
The date or the movie?
Well, it could be a little bit of both, but we're here to talk about the movie. We're here to talk about the movie. We actually just did a review of this not that long ago, so the timing is quite impeccable here.
Absolutely.
I'll be perfectly honest. If you go and listen to that review, Brendan and I weren't the biggest fans of the film, but a lot of people are, and this is a film that is up for some Oscars. It's been part of the conversation of award season all season long, really. It's just been there quietly, kind of sticking around. And if this is something that you want to check out for awards purposes, or maybe you're just interested in the story, it is a rich part of American history, world history, really.
Yeah.
We have 5 digital codes to give away if you want to check this out. And if you want to be a part of that, if you want to win one of these digital codes, be sure to follow us on social media, on Instagram and Twitter especially. Just search at InSession Film. You'll find us on those platforms. And we will have a post later out in the week that you can participate with, engage with the tweet, and you'll be entered automatically into winning one of these digital codes. We picked the winners at random, so you can be on the lookout for that. September 5. It has some compelling things in it.
As a thriller, I think people will enjoy it.
I agree. Like, it does work really well as a thriller for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So be on the lookout for that. September 5 later on this week, and we thank them for their support. All right, Brennan, we have a new sponsor. Let's talk about NordVPN.
Let's do this. Absolutely.
So NordVPN is perfect for those traveling, but maybe even if you're at home and you want to enjoy the benefits of your paid subscriptions, in a fast and secure way, protecting you from perhaps prying eyes online that want to take advantage of you. NordVPN will protect you by changing your IP address as you use their service. They will secure online traffic through encryption, making it hard to spy or hijack your data. And that is the important thing. That's the dangers
Yeah, especially given the rise of phishing and smishing attacks nowadays, you need something as strong as NordVPN, and it's also available on all major operating systems, including smart TVs and routers. So it's easily transferable and relatable to any of the tech that you have working with internet purposes.
Absolutely, and it's picked as the best VPN by PC Mag, Forbes, Wired, Tech Advisor, and many other outlets. They have 7,200 servers in 118 countries. The options are endless. The speeds for NordVPN are absolutely remarkable. And if that's not enough, NordVPN will not track user data. They're not here to
so secure and safe,
take advantage of you. They just want you to be secure online. And they have everything in store in order for that to happen. So if you want to go overseas and you want to watch all your stuff back home as you're traveling, NordVPN, it's your friend. It's your friend. So with our link, our affiliate link, you can get NordVPN free for 30 days, for 30 days. And that link will be in the description of this episode, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Just look in our description, and you'll see a link there. Click on that, and when you sign up, you'll get 30 days for free. So go check it out. Stay connected. Be safe out there on the open seas of the internet. It can be a dangerous place, so you want to be safe. And we thank NordVPN for their support. At any rate, let's go ahead and transition. We'll move away from award season. Let's talk David Lynch. It is unfortunate that we are doing this retrospective off the heels of his passing some weeks ago. But we wanted to have a David Lynch retrospective. We have caught up with all of his feature films aside from Twin Peaks. I have not seen any of Twin Peaks, the show. And I have been warned not to watch the movie if I haven't seen the show. So I did stay away from Fire Walk with Me. But I did catch up with all of his other features. Brendan did as well. We're going to talk about them here, kind of go film by film. We're not going to give full reviews. Obviously, we're not going to be here for the next 7 hours talking about David Lynch.
This is this is not a good idea. You know, in retrospect, I'm thinking about this. We obviously wanted to do this David Lynch retrospective here in honor of his legacy, really. But to try to get through all of his films in about an hour, wow. That we're setting ourselves up for failure. We're setting ourselves up for failure.
We did. I mean, really, we probably should have just done the retrospective and nothing else, but it was a crazy, chaotic awards week with CCA and everything. We had to talk about it.
Yeah, but you also have to realize, too, that even though we're doing this some weeks, almost a month away from his passing, I feel like a lot of people are still talking about his passing, which is kind of, I don't want to say incredible because that seems to suggest something positive, but it does go to show just how impactful this man was in the world of film, whether we really knew it or not. I even talked to strangers who just happened to know who this man was. And they say, oh, he's the guy that made The Elephant Man, right? So yeah, it's like, how do you know that? It's like, I just know this. This is kind of part of film culture, the zeitgeist of it all. And he was a huge, member of that zeitgeist.
Yep. He is deeply embedded into film lore and was absolutely a part of the cultural zeitgeist during his time. And some of these, as we'll talk about, they will go down as all-timers. Absolutely. There was no one like David Lynch. I don't think there will ever be anyone else like David Lynch. He's such a fascinating filmmaker. And we'll talk about him as we go here and what makes him so special and unique. Let's get into these. And again, we're not giving full reviews here. We're going to just do our best to quickly go through them all and give our thoughts on them. So let's talk about Eraserhead, 1977. And this is, again, speaking to your point about the cultural impact of this film. Even if you've never seen Eraserhead, you've seen images from Eraserhead. They're everywhere.
The iconography is so iconic. It really is.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. I agree. Yeah. What are your thoughts on Eraserhead?
And it should be known that when we say we caught up with all these films, these 9 films that don't include anything Twin Peaks related, many of these, if not all of these, we have seen before. In many ways, these were revisits for us and now looking at this through the lens of David Lynch's unfortunate passing. And man, his films really do change when you look at it through that context and the legacy he left behind. Because I think in a weird way, his passing allows us to see the genuine sincerity in all of his films that don't seem to be all that sentimental on the surface, but there is this huge emotional core to all of his movies, which is so strange to say.
Yeah.
And I sense that in Eraserhead more than I ever have before. It's a film I've always loved. But now I guess due to recent unfortunate circumstances, I can now tell people the Mutant Baby movie made me cry. I could safely say that now. This is certainly the closest thing that David Lynch has made to, I mean, he's always made movies that are kind of horror adjacent in a way, but this is perhaps the closest to being what you'd find on a list of, let's say, the best horror movies of the 1970s, right? I feel like genre-wise, it's closer to that than anything else he's made. I think it's now one of the best horror films ever made because of how much of an emotional core exists in a movie that you might not even realize is even there. The circumstances of how it was made is pretty incredible, given that I think this took almost 5 years for him to make as like a student film of his. Also, at the same time, his daughter was born, and that certainly plays a huge part into the film central emotional core, as I know you're going to talk about. I think it is maybe Lynch's most nightmarish movie because it is coming from a real nightmarish place that new parents find themselves in, right? And I think that's what makes it one of my favorites of his. We're not going to really talk negatively about any of these movies. So when we say one of them is our favorites, it could even be ranked at the bottom of the list, right? But this is high up there for me. I think this is a great one.
Yeah, I love this as well. And you're right, to reiterate, because we did talk about this a month ago after his passing, and we had a little conversation on David Lynch. And in that conversation, we talked about how Lynch was a filmmaker that wanted us to feel cinema, right? Art didn't need to be explainable. He wanted to invoke interpretation. He wanted us to, to let our feelings take us to this transcendent place in a way that only the medium of film can do. Eraserhead is quintessentially that, right? And
it absolutely
I completely agree with you in the sense that it evokes interpretation. It is surreal, and that is the DNA of David Lynch. He was a surrealist filmmaker, but he was also a sentimentalist. I wholeheartedly agree. We're going to talk about that a lot as we go here.
Yeah.
Steven Spielberg gets this reputation for being a sentimentalist.
Yeah.
I don't think he comes close to David Lynch in that regard, especially post 2000.
Yeah, I think you might be right.
David Lynch is cinema's greatest sentimentalist, but he was also cinema's greatest surrealist. And how he was able to blur those two things together in every one of his films is deeply, deeply impressive. And Eraserhead is one of those weird movies, at least for me, again, going back to Lynch and his ideas of interpretation when it comes to film, because it is very strange, very surreal, ethereal, and he uses a lot of symbolism and just flat out bizarreness to tell the story. And yet I feel like it might be the film of his that on a thematic level, I have the best grasp of, at least as it relates to my interpretation. Now, my interpretation might not be what it is for Brendan or for others listening. Hell, it might not even be exactly what it is for David Lynch. Who knows? But as it relates to the film's ideas on fatherhood or parenthood and the fears and the deep anxieties that you experience when you're becoming a father for the first time, that I do think is extremely visceral in the film. And ultimately, I think that is what it is trying to be. And you're right, it is haunting. It is very disturbing. It is a deeply brooding, harrowing film in a lot of ways. And yet it's also very evocative and moving. So I'm with you. As much as I was taken aback by the horror of the film, I was also drawn into it emotionally. And that's why I love it. Unsettling in the best ways possible.
Yeah, it's very dystopian as well. There is a weird sci-fi component to it within this industrial landscape that's obviously nameless. It's not directly named or even referenced as to what this is, and I love that for it. But what I love about David Lynch too is that he almost seemed ahead of the curve with what many other films would do afterwards, whether he was a direct influence on these other films or not, because the visual landscape of this movie and just the overall sense of place and the way it looks, the industrialization of it, it reminds me a lot of a film that came out 2 years after Eraserhead, and that was Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker. And I kind of wonder, like, are there things that David Lynch was doing that would then bleed into other films that were not necessarily in the same, I guess, company as movies like Eraserhead or anything else David Lynch would make, which I think just goes to show how ahead of the curve he was. I'm with you as far as the film's emotional core and the things that I gravitated from it. I think our interpretations at this point are pretty similar. I was definitely more invested in the film's ideas on parenthood and you know how you would feel, you know, giving birth to something that you perceive as this quote unquote monster that's sucking your life away, which is essentially maybe what happens when you become a parent.
But that's it. Like again, not trying to get too deep into the weeds here because we have so much else to talk about. Yeah. But yeah, in terms of the monstrousness of it all, how it seems to drain your life away, how it takes you into this alien space, this alien world, that is parenthood. Like psychologically, it becomes otherworldly in a lot of ways. Yeah. And some of that is because the baby won't stop crying and you feel like you just want to leave. That imagery of the film, or just not knowing what to do. Like, again, you feel like an alien in a spaceship. And like how that comes across in the film, I think is absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah. And you know, the film works. The emotional core of the film works when someone who's not even watching it, like let's say my wife, for instance, I was watching this in our living room and she comes in sporadically, maybe to come into the kitchen or something like that. And she sees what I'm watching, and it's this weird black and white grotesque movie that she's obviously never seen before. But she walks in during some of the sequences of this mutant baby looking like it's sick and in pain. And even her reaction is, I feel bad for that thing. That'd be just without any context. Like somehow David Lynch is able to find real genuine pity within the grotesquerie. And that's a real knack of great filmmaking right there.
And that's exactly what it is. Like he does give empathy to the creature for sure. Yeah. And that is part of the emotional core of the film is how we may look at it, how the characters might look at it, what happens to the little creature. And it does evoke an emotional response. Yeah. And to see Lynch demonstrate the empathy the way he does it's that combination of surrealism and pathos. It's a fantastic mix.
And I think it's really interesting how this might be a nice transition into his second film, The Elephant Man from 1980, which in many ways feels like an outlier in his filmography. But I think for reasons we're about to get into, we'll talk about why it's anything but an outlier in his filmography. I think it's the perfect second film following a movie like Eraserhead. I've seen many people say it's almost as if The Elephant Man is like this quasi sequel to Eraserhead. What if that child were to grow up and become a full-fledged human being? What would that life be like? So, and I don't think that was the intent, but in a way, some of those grotesque sensibilities from Eraserhead do play a very significant thematic role in The Elephant Man. And it's a perfect transition, I think.
It really is. And I know that you're really high on The Elephant Man. I believe the last time we talked, this was your favorite Lynch. Is that correct?
On a rewatch, I would still say that. And I think it's because it was a formative film for me. It's one that I saw quite young, maybe back in high school when I was really investigating classic cinema for the first time. And this was in many ways my introduction to what a David Lynch movie was, which maybe isn't the best introduction in many ways, because I feel like other films following this would be more quote unquote Lynchian by definition. But I think his trademarks are still here. There are many reasons as to why this movie work so well for me even now. I don't want to get too heavily into them now. I'll let you speak first because it was your introduction to this. I think this was a first time watch for you, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Yeah, so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this, but I think it's a genuinely moving film in ways that are not the most conventionally moving. I think having a name like David Lynch attached to a movie like this gives it a very different type of emotional sensibility than, let's say, another director would. I think this is one of the best movies ever made about human empathy. And for reasons I'll get into later. But rewatching again, this probably is my favorite of his.
Yeah, I love this film. I love this film as well. And I think what's interesting about The Elephant Man is that it might be Lynch's most accessible. Maybe not his least experimental, because we'll talk about The Straight Story later, which is an accessible movie as well. But you could argue there's more experimentation going on there, given certain restraints that he's up against. Yeah. With The Elephant Man, you certainly have flourishes here that are, as we've come to call it, Lynchian.
Yeah, the bookends especially, I think, are certainly
the bookends
representative
especially.
Of that. Yeah.
However, it does feature a little surrealism, and there is that emotional pathos that comes to define Lynch for sure. And I expected that, given who I know Lynch to be, given what this material is, and the human underbelly of it. I was expecting some sort of emotional reaction. What I wasn't expecting is that the composition and framing and camera movement is unlike any other Lynch film. Sure. That is where this film is an outlier, big time. And I don't know if it's because this is his second film and he's trying to still figure out what his identity as a filmmaker is going to be. You know, Eraserhead is an incredibly experimental film in a lot of ways, for sure. And you see his DNA poured out into that movie. Now, once we get to Blue Velvet, that's the David Lynch that we would come to see for the rest of his career.
Yeah.
The Elephant Man might be him still trying to figure that out. And I think what's so interesting is that from a cinematography perspective, this is way more Spielberg than it is David Lynch. And I was pretty blown away by that.
It's pretty cool. Yeah. Yeah. Especially given the fact that we find ourselves comparing Lynch to Spielberg now that we've thought about his films after his passing and how sentimental that they actually are. This is certainly his most quote unquote Spielbergian film by comparison. And maybe he is still trying to find himself a little bit because the camera moves in a very methodical way that takes its time. It's not as surrealistic, if that's the right word to tie it to. Yet at the same time, he is still doing things with regard to his traditional use of fade outs and transitions between scenes that do feel very Lynchian in its own way.
Sure.
But where I think this feels still very Lynchian is the emotional response it's giving off and how it raises questions about what it's choosing to portray. I think that's the thing that I gravitated more towards on this rewatch, and how it sort of utilizes John Merrick as kind of an exploitative figure in many ways. Like the way the movie is filmed at times, especially in the first third, it almost has this aura of a Universal monster movie in some ways. Like there is a very terrifying aspect to it, which I can understand might put some people off, that it seems as if David Lynch is exploiting the unfortunate conditions of someone like John Merrick. But this is a movie that I think is all about trying to point a finger at that use of exploitation and how it maybe works in real life. Because it almost brings us as the audience into this conversation, asking the question, how would we truly react in a situation like this? We would obviously say we feel pity and compassion for a man like John Merrick, but what if we were approached in real life by him? Would that change? Would we react differently? How do we separate the genuinely good people from the hypocrites? Because there are people here that are treating him with kindness, but they're doing it for their own egos, right? And even Frederick Treves, played by Anthony Hopkins, kind of wrestles with that notion, whether he was a part of that. Like the way that this movie utilizes and critiques exploitation, putting us in the shoes of the victimizers instead of the victims, is a really, really tricky thing. And I don't know if that was Lynch's approach. or if that was even his intent. But it makes this a very provocative film, I think. And I noticed that more when I gave this one a rewatch, especially in context with his entire filmography.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with that. I think from a character perspective, from an emotional perspective, it does such a great job of balancing those perspectives and how Merrick found himself struggling by being this outcast that people wanted to look and gawk at and be repulsed by. And that was really the only way for him to make any sort of living whatsoever, even though he was wholly exploited and all of that. And it explains why even when he first meets Dr. Treves, he's hesitant to form some sort of connection there until you see Treves treat him with some sincerity and empathy.
Yeah.
And even as that relationship evolves, you're right, it is fascinating to see Treves wrestle with if what he's doing is any better than the people running the circus.
Yeah.
You know,
what was his name? Bites. Yeah. Because even Bites, the man who claims to own John Merrick, I think he even says to Treves at one point in the hospital, I have it written down here. He said, "You wanted the freak to show those doctor chums of yours to make a name for yourself." And in a way, he's at least at first, he's not wrong. He's not wrong there.
He's right. No, yeah. I mean, that's exactly why Dr. Treves wanted Merrick to study him, to perhaps show him off as some sort of medical miracle. And while I don't think Treves was as conscious with it, like I think he
he has an arc, and he comes to realize that, I guess, that ignorance that he had, and then it has a clearly defined arc that you buy into the empathy he has for John Merrick as a genuine friend of his.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all done through a sincere lens for sure. But underneath that sincerity, and again, it isn't mutually exclusive. He did treat Merrick with empathy, but perhaps some of those motives, especially early on, maybe they were a little bit selfish. It was a little bit of both. And to see him wrestle with that is quite fascinating. And you couple that with the filmmaking. I did want to go back to that. I had more I wanted to say on that, and then we kind of pivoted. But
sorry,
when it's fine. But because that to me is maybe what I'm most fascinated with the Elephant Man. I think those ideas, the empathy, a lot the Lynchian isms of the film, I think, are truly really great. I don't want to overlook them. But the Elephant Man is such an outlier to Lynch's filmography in ways I just did not expect. I do love the characterization here, and on an emotional level, it is a little compelling too, because I wasn't as emotionally, at least overtly emotionally moved as I expected to be, especially given your response to the film and what we've discussed before, until we get to those final scenes. And then like those like the last 10 minutes is where it obliterated me. That's kind of where I fell apart. I thought that, so I was waiting for the shoe to drop, and I was like, maybe I'm just going to react to this differently than Brendan did. And then we get the final 10 minutes, and I was like, oh, okay, I see what he's saying.
The way the camera moves around John Merrick's creation of that cathedral, as if like it's a great way to conclude his arc before he makes the choice to sleep the way he does. And you see his autographed name on this piece of art that he created, and that music from John Morris swells to back it up. It's cinematic language like that just moves me, and it comes at the right time. And then you have obviously John Merrick's choice to try to find his own humanity in the end. I think
it's that cinematic language is why I'm more blown away from this than the actual emotion itself. Because again, it's so unlike David Lynch's, like the rest of his filmography, that I just did not expect that. Like the camera often moves, or it sweeps, or there's trickeration within the camera work that, again, the only way I can describe it is we've seen this forever with Spielberg.
We've seen it with Spielberg,
if that's a coincidence. Because in 1980, Spielberg is also coming into his own, right? He had done Jaws. I think the year previously, he did Close Encounters. So like he's still very young in his own journey, that ultimately this is probably just a coincidence. And they're maybe working with similar artists or cinematographers. I don't really know. I don't have the information in front of me. But I just find the irony hilarious to me, because I see so much of Spielberg's craft in terms of specifically the composition and framing and blocking is so Spielberg here. But you couple that with everything else we're talking about, and I think that's what makes The Elephant Man so very deserving of all of its accolades.
Yeah, he being David Lynch is clearly influenced by a lot of classic cinema here, maybe some of the same films and filmmakers that even went on to influence Steven Spielberg. So maybe that's where the comparisons are, because at this point Spielberg has maybe
that's what it is.
Yeah, maybe the only comparison you can make is something like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That's really all Spielberg maybe has to pull from as a very contemporary influence for David Lynch. But the way that way that final sequence plays out, the way the camera moves around that cathedral that John Merrick has built, I was thinking a lot about maybe some of those final swing set shots in the snow in Akira Kurosawa's Akiru. So maybe he's pulling from similar things like that, which obviously would probably go on to influence Spielberg as well. So maybe that's where the comparisons ultimately lie, or where the influence ultimately lies. But yeah, it is so interesting to see David Lynch pulling from a different filmmaking landscape, while still maintaining the grotesquerie that makes a David Lynch film. It's a weird marriage that I think makes it work so well. This is not just a safe Lynch film. It's not just that. There is more going on here that makes it weirdly compelling.
I agree. All right, let's move on to Dune. I don't know if
this will be quick.
A lot of
this will be
here.
Quick.
But 1984's Dune, maybe not his best work, but I don't think it's I do think there's still a lot of Lynch here. It's
I don't
very
hate it.
weird.
I don't hate it at all.
Either. I think if he had the kind of resources that Denis had, for example, I could see why this material fits David Lynch's sensibilities, because Dune does have a lot of weird lore to it, and these fascinating components that I think do come alive because of his so-called Lynchian isms. I think ultimately you're working against so much material that you have to condense to 2 hours, that I don't care who you are. You could be Spielberg, you could be Orson Welles. It's going to be really, really challenging to take that dense of material and make it work in 2 hours. And I think ultimately that's what's working against the film more than anything else.
There's a lot working against the film. On one hand, it almost feels like an attempt to commercialize the sensibilities of David Lynch, which is not really a good idea. It's also as if
that, I guess.
Yeah, I guess it's not a good idea in and of itself. But this is also like, let's say you imagine a movie like Blade Runner, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner from 1982, just 2 years before Dune would ever come out. And as many people are aware, the version of Blade Runner that we tend to know and love nowadays is not the version that came out in 1982. It was littered with voiceover narration that was put in by the studio, courtesy of Harrison Ford, right? Imagine taking that voiceover narration and multiplying it by like 50. That's basically the experience of Dune in many ways.
The first 10 minutes is just voiceover narration explaining this world. That's all that it is.
But sadly,
no
it kind of
film happening.
It kind of makes the movie, for lack of a better term, boring. I think that's really its biggest problem. If this were a silent movie with no dialogue whatsoever, I would have absolutely vibed with this, because I think visually this movie's insane. I think it really looks interesting.
Oh yeah.
And it's very much my jam. It's a wild movie in that way. But I think in many ways it really does come down to the interference of trying to make this more translatable across different audiences, and that backfires, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I do love that it's brazenly weird at times. When this film is full on David Lynch, it actually is quite good. Yeah. Unfortunately, it is trying to appeal to a mass audience, as you're saying. And I do think that they needed to perhaps stick to certain storylines to make it more concise, because again, you're trying to condense all of this down to 2 hours. And this is where Denis probably did it right. And it's hard not to look at this through the prism of both of Denis' Dune films.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that the majority of this film, of David Lynch's Dune, the first 90 minutes of it is essentially Dune Part 1.
Yeah.
So if he was just able to tell Dune Part 1 as his Dune, and you give him some room to let some of these characters or some of his Lynchianisms breathe a little bit, then I think it actually could have been really good, like genuinely really good. But then there's the, you know, the whole back half of Dune when the character becomes the Messiah. And like Dune Part 2, Denis' Dune Part 2, which is 2 hours on its own, is condensed to 30 minutes here.
Yeah.
Like that whole
really took that time with Paul Atreides' arc. Yeah, but this one does not.
This does not. And the last 30 to 45 minutes of this film is the worst of David Lynch. Yeah. Not just, I mean that very specifically, because I think the first 90 minutes are not that terrible. A little messy for sure, for the reasons we're talking about, but it's not terrible because, again, it's essentially the same narrative and plotting as Dune Part 1. But then the last 30 minutes, you're condensing another 2 hour movie into 30 minutes. And it is really not good.
It's not
really
good.
Not good.
And you could definitely see how Lynch's own hands were tied behind his back, and he couldn't and he couldn't get final cut, obviously. But if anything, though, I'm glad this movie as it is exists, because we need fascinating failures like this in order to make way for better things. And clearly, Denis Villeneuve's version of this story is better. It's a better crafted, more realized vision. It's more consistent. I think in many ways Lynch's version is more interesting. It's not better, but I like that it exists as this relic of the 80s of what filmmaking interference can be that could then lead to better things. So in a way, while I don't love it, I would not really change anything about it, because if it were great, God only knows what the landscape of film would be now. You know, it would completely change the arc of it. Yeah,
I mean, I love that it is what it is as well, simply for the relic of it all, I guess. But also, we don't get Villeneuve's Dunes, I think, without it. Like, I think he approaches the studios and goes, look, there are two really good movies here. You see how Lynch's film failed because they tried to condense all of this material into one film. Let me have two movies here, and I'll make it worth your time. And obviously that worked because those movies got greenlit and they were very successful. Yeah. So, you know, and you're right, that doesn't happen without the failure of this film. So, and I love those two movies, so I'm not complaining. If it took a Lynch failure for those two films to be born, that's okay with me, especially because we have the rest of Lynch's films we could talk about.
Oh yeah, and what comes next is absolutely worth talking about.
Yeah, so let's move on to the masterpiece that is Blue Velvet.
Yeah, it is a masterpiece. I think that's all we have to say about it.
Yeah. I mean, this is a film that kind of changed the form and what movies can be in a lot of ways.
And in many ways, also kind of the maybe the almost unofficial debut of a Lynchian film in some ways. Now, all of that was certainly there with Eraserhead and The Elephant Man, and in some cases Dune, like we just talked about. But the coloration of Blue Velvet, the sensibilities and the comedic sensibilities that are hidden underneath the sentimental stuff, I feel like that becomes most realized and consistently pulled together in a movie like Blue Velvet that would then set the stage for everything else to come afterwards. This is probably most comparable to something like his show Twin Peaks, which I haven't finished watching. I did start watching it, and I could definitely see a lot of comparisons, even thematically here. But I think it is quite the magic trick how Lynch was able to make something that is this narratively linear, but still feels so otherworldly in a way. This is narratively probably one of Lynch's more accessible films. It doesn't quite have the confusion of his other films, right? That would certainly come later. I think this is an easier film to follow than, let's say, a Mulholland Drive or an Inland Empire, right?
Sure.
But I think it's a film that's all about contrast, where everything and nothing seems real at the exact same time. And there are many things going on here that make it one of the most fascinating films of the 80s, and in my opinion, one of Lynch's best films.
Yeah, I think I do have this as my number one. As much as I love Mulholland Drive, we'll maybe briefly talk about that here in a little bit. But I love Blue Velvet. I love Blue Velvet. In as I noted, in the historical context of film, this is a movie that reinvents what cinema is capable of. And you couple that with what is one of the more fascinating elements of David Lynch's films, that is at the core of who he is as a storyteller. He is somehow able to, and it really begins with Blue Velvet onward, although you do see this as well in Eraserhead. He is somehow able to make these incredibly surreal experiences full of rich symbolism and metaphor, and they're often ethereal in a lot of ways. And he's able to marry that with these fascinating mysteries, or these neo-noir elements that hook you in to the movie as a movie.
Yeah.
So you're enthralled by the mystery of it, these characters, the identity of who they are, and how we engage with them. And he somehow mixes that with these surrealistic elements. And that really begins, I think, as far as how we identify with David Lynch, that really begins here with Blue Velvet. Yeah. And man, I think he absolutely nails it here. Like in terms of those Lynchianisms, those are really great here, but I was so hooked to this film as a mystery thriller as well.
Oh, same here. Yeah.
It's so really good. And you couple that with Kyle MacLachlan, who is fantastic here. Isabella Rossellini is really, really good. Laura Dern, who would go on to become such a staple with David Lynch, is fantastic in this film. And then so like in terms of just the form, in terms of the experimentation, it's working as a neo-noir mystery thriller. It's working as a Lynchian surrealistic experimentation. So you have that element of it. And then there's the David Lynch sentimentalist aspect, because he pours so much empathy into these characters as well. So like underneath the form of it is this bubbling underbelly of pathos that gives this film this resonance as well. And it's all of those elements are somehow working together. And I feel like in the hands of most other filmmakers, one, if not all of those elements would fall apart.
Sure.
But with him, he makes it seem easy. He makes it effortless. And it is the brilliance of who he is as a filmmaker. And I maybe love it the most with Blue Velvet. Although, to your point earlier, they're all really great.
They're all really great.
Like
yeah. It's like 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 1E, 1F.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of where it is. But like, man, I love that with Blue Velvet, though.
It is one of my favorites for all those reasons. It is certainly his most, I guess, balanced film in that way, which is saying something, given how different all of those sensibilities are that you very eloquently described. Because on one hand, it is all of those things, but on the other hand, it's also a very demented coming-of-age film in many ways. I think Kyle MacLachlan is fascinating here as this sort of young soul coming to realize that his beautiful town is not all it's cracked up to be. The way that he tackles
depravity, and it's dark.
The way he tackles that suburban idealism, and given the fact that, Midwestern suburbalism specifically, and given the fact that David Lynch is from Montana, so it's definitely very much something that's close to his heart, right? He wears it very much on his chest, and it's very evident in this movie. He's very much deconstructing that middle America idyllic lifestyle, and that there might be more going on underneath than we realize. There's a huge underbelly happening here, a grossness to it that we don't often see. And
it's not even just the revelation of that, because I do agree, but I also think there's an idea of confronting that in order to find some sort of truth and understanding and growth. Yeah. So it's the revelation of it and then also the confronting of it. Those two things happening simultaneously.
Yeah. And he symbolizes that really well too, even though some of it's a bit more, I don't mean this negatively, because I think the emotional core is still there. I think some of the symbolism here is a bit more on the nose than other films, like the idea of the robins coming in to basically eat the insects, and it's pretty clear who the robins are in this case and who the insects are. So I you could certainly understand that analogy, but again, David Lynch is a filmmaker that was all about making you feel cinema, not necessarily always understand cinema. Yeah. And when it gets to that conclusion, while there is sort of a winkiness to it that's kind of funny in a very Lynchian way, I did feel genuinely moved by that he does feel like there is ultimately a light at the end of this tunnel as far as who can actually be there to keep this idyllic lifestyle a bit more intact. Right. I think there is beauty in all of that.
I agree. No, I agree. I think it is really gorgeous, really beautiful, in the midst of all of this brooding darkness. And I think that's what's so great about the coming of age aspects of it. There's so much complexity to this film, and I love the symbolism, as obvious as it may be. And that's another thing with Lynch, is he throws in a lot of symbolism in his films, and oftentimes it isn't all that ambiguous. Like there's a transparency to some of it. Sure. Sometimes it's odd, and it is just completely surreal, especially when you get to something like Inland Empire. We'll talk about how that film might just be impossible to pin down.
Oh, there's a reason for that too. Yeah, well, I can't wait to talk about that.
Yeah. But sometimes, again, it's not about the complexity of the symbolism or the profundity of it as much as it is, to your point, the emotional resonance of it. And I think the symbolism of this film in that regard, I think, is really well calculated and well executed. And again, just kind of blurring the lines of surrealism and attainability. I think he walks that line perfectly here, and with some really compelling characters. And it's, it's interesting, like Dorothy and Jeffrey, their relationship, and I love the emotional balance that Lynch brings to it. Or even with Sandy and Jeffrey, Laura Dern and Kyle MacLachlan, like they're really endearing.
I love their connection. Well. I really do. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, their connection is fantastic. I could have watched the whole movie of just that alone.
I just want a romance of that. Yeah.
I know. I completely agree. And then you get Dennis Hopper's Frank character, which almost feels like it comes from a different movie. Like he's so out there. But again, like that's where Lynch and how he's able to, I don't know how to articulate, but maybe that's how Lynch wants.
I don't know how to. But like somehow the balance is just right. But you're right. It
makes it work. Yeah.
He does feel like it comes from a different movie, but the whole point of this movie is discovering something that feels like it came from a different world. It is about that discovery. So in a way, it does feel of a piece thematically.
Exactly. That well said. That's exactly what it is. This is about Jeffrey understanding or coming to realize that his idealistic world doesn't really exist, or at least there's another a darker aspect to it that he did not know about before, and becomes entangled in it in a way he did not expect either. But yeah, that's what makes it fascinating. Yeah, and Dennis Hopper plays that perfectly for sure.
Oh, he does. Great movie. Absolutely great movie. And I will say we sometimes see lawsuits in place for movies that maybe plagiarize other things, or sometimes you see it more in music than anything else. But I am surprised there was never a lawsuit against American Beauty for totally plagiarizing the art direction to Blue Velvet. Those opening shots are straight up American Beauty, and how that movie did not get accused of that is kind of astounding to me.
It is kind of astounding. I never really thought about that because I don't think about American Beauty all that much, but now that you bring it up, you're right.
It's a movie I admittedly used to love, and I'm kind of ashamed to admit it.
Yeah, I know. Well, I think a lot of us probably.
I think a lot of us were caught up in that Kool-Aid at the time.
Yeah, for sure. All right, let's move on. 1990, Wild at Heart. What do you think about that one?
So this is the one that I most recently revisited in preparation for this episode. So maybe it is still a little bit fresh in my mind, and it's also the one that I had the biggest disparity between when I first saw it and when I gave it this rewatch. My first time seeing Wild at Heart was probably back in my college days, so probably even before I was 20 years old, which means that was over a decade ago. There was a lot about it that I was seeing again for the first time in many ways. I think it is a really interesting companion to Wild at Heart. Not to Wild at Heart, to Blue Velvet specifically, which came out before, because I think in many ways they're both kind of demented coming of age films. And I think this one's just more romantic by comparison, I guess. I think it's the perfect title for a David Lynch film because it kind of encapsulates David Lynch as a filmmaker, right? Yeah, I think this is one of the most fun experiences I had watching a David Lynch film. It's not one of my favorites though. There are others I do prefer. I think if anything, this is maybe where he's slowly tapping into the surrealism that we would come to associate with him a little bit more. And I don't know if he quite has the level of control over it as he would in other movies later on.
But maybe that's intentional.
Well, yeah, you're not wrong.
It's called Wild at Heart. It's meant to be a little bit wild and chaotic.
It is a sloppy movie by comparison. It's definitely more of a stylistic exercise by comparison. There are flashbacks here that are very jarring, but also kind of interestingly jarring. The way that they sometimes reveal backstories that characters know about, but are refusing to actually say to other people. So it's like this. It's basically cueing the audience into something as if it's a form of lying in a way. So I kind of appreciated the ironic use of them. But it does make for a very interesting and dreamlike movie about loss of innocence and wish fulfillment, especially from these two characters' points of views of both Sailor and Lula for really interesting reasons. So yeah, I enjoyed this one a lot more by comparison to some of the others. It's just a really fun experience.
I love this movie, mess and all. And maybe that's just the David Lynch bias in me. I don't really know. But there is something about how it explores these ideas of love and violence and fate all within the David Lynch mechanics. And it has all of it, right? In the sense that there's still this like murder, violent mystery thriller at its core. It has these weird surrealistic moments as we're talking about. It's got the symbolism. This film infuses the Wizard of Oz of all things. Of all things, the Wizard of Oz is all over this film.
Yeah, but it's utilized in a really good thematic way. I actually love the utilization of the Wizard of Oz here.
Yeah, and I think maybe you can help me narrow it down a little bit. I don't know in this conversation, but maybe in an offline conversation. Like the Wizard of Oz to me is a little bit of what we were just saying with Blue Velvet in the sense that some of the symbolism is obvious. Other times it's not. The Wizard of Oz is a little bit of both for me in the sense that the way those elements reinforce ideas of destiny and escape and this search for a better life. I understand it from that perspective. There are elements of it that I also just can't wrap my head around that are a little loose and just ambiguous, I guess. Like, I do wonder if there's more to it than that. Maybe not, but there's something like, I don't know if it's that easily transparent. I wonder if David Lynch had more in mind with the Wizard of Oz. Either way, I just find the implementation of all of that so fascinating. And again, it's heavily romantic. This is one of his most titillating films. There's a lot of sex and nudity here, and that's something that he would not shy away from. But this is our first foray into that realm with David Lynch. And to see Nick Cage and Laura Dern really go full bore into that, I think is really fantastic. But like that duality of sex and violence here, I think is really, really compelling. And then you have the character of Bobby Peru, and I can't say enough good things about Willem Dafoe. Like, he's just
Greatest
so
great,
good.
greatest cinematic teeth of all time.
I love him.
Oh,
Like,
and
as
and the
these characters,
yeah.
there's just no one does it better. And man, he's so compelling here.
the way his art crystallizes is one of the funniest things I think I've seen in a David Lynch film. It's so anticlimactic in a way that knows that it is.
Yeah, it's so
but
ridiculous.
But I
Yeah.
think, pointing to Willem Dafoe, I think is one of the film's greatest strengths just overall, is really the conviction of these performances. I think that's the film's greatest strength. Willem Dafoe is obviously one of them. Nicolas Cage and Laura Dern have electric chemistry. Diane Ladd is
off her
quite,
rocker.
quite
Off her
incredible here.
rocker.
Yeah, and classic actress in and of her own right, but obviously known for films like Chinatown and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. The first thing I think I remember seeing her in was National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, where she played Chevy Chase's mother, and like she was very sweet and tender in that movie. So it's a very different dynamic, and that was only maybe 1 or 2 years apart between that film and this film. So
And she was
definitely
nominated. Diane Ladd was nominated, as was Willem Dafoe, I believe. So like for an Oscar, like they were, or no, Diane Ladd was the only one nominated for an Oscar.
She was the only one nominated, but I think there was maybe more awards love the film received outside of them, because this is also a film that won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film
won the
Festival.
Palme d'Or. Yeah, I
Yeah,
do remember Lynch winning the Palme.
Yeah, very.
Fascinating.
If Lynch is ever going to win that award, they picked a very interesting one for it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. No, I do like, I do really love this film a lot. I think it is certainly a little messier. It is more wild. Again, I kind of wonder how intentional that is, because Lynch, as we would certainly come to see a little bit later, he was not afraid to experiment. And I think there's a little bit of him being a little loosey-goosey here, I think kind of intentionally, because this is a film that has a lot of rock and roll energy to it. There's fantasy and myth at play. It has these dreamlike components to it. So I think he wanted it to feel a little looser than something like Blue Velvet, where, as we noted, he had such a tight grasp on that film in every way. And it's a masterpiece as a result. But I do love that it has all those Lynch-isms, if you will, but I do love how he's willing to kind of let go a little bit and just kind of let the heart of the film, if you will, kind of take him where he wanted to as they were making it.
There are at least 2 moments here where the title is uttered where I felt like Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen. I definitely had a few of those moments here. Exactly. This is his Loss of Innocence movie. I know I call Blue Velvet a demented coming of age film in many ways, but I think that idea of loss of innocence is more apparent here than in any other Lynch film, because it has this dreamlike quality about 2 lost, really childlike souls just trying to stay young and be free of the responsibilities of the world and the things that they've been caught up in, only for it to sneak up on them. And that certainly felt
it's about that innocent relationship, and the world is trying to tear them down, trying to tear them apart. Like, no one wants them together. You have all these people trying to kill Sailor. Lulu's mom does not want them to be together. And like, the world, everyone around them is trying to rip them apart, and they're doing everything they can to keep that romanticism intact. I completely agree. And again, that's where the film working as a film is really great, but you infuse that with Lynch's surrealistic qualities and symbolism. And I think he's able to marry that for the most part really well. Yeah. Even if it's a little bit out there. And the other thing that we haven't really mentioned yet that is certainly a big part of this film as well, like, Lynch's opening shots are almost always symbolic and have some sort of thematic purpose that makes sense as the film goes. Almost always. That is the case. Whether it's the night sky, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. It's the birds and the insects, as we talked about Blue Velvet. This opens with fire as the opening credits go, and that becomes a symbolic, not just symbolic, but there's a plotting element to that as well that ties to what you're saying in terms of these characters and how their innocence is taken away from them, because we find out, through flashback about Lula's father and what happened to him and how fire was a part of that. So like, a lot of the way he opens and closes his films is very, very purposeful.
Yeah.
Again, even if in hindsight it's not all that ambiguous, but like I kind of love how he kind of ties all that together.
Yeah, and symbolically, I think it all works as well. And that's why I do love the Wizard of Oz references as a thematic reference more than anything else, even if some specific references I don't fully understand in the context of the film. But then there are others, like when Lula, played by Laura Dern, experiences a very traumatic moment with Bobby, played by Willem Dafoe, that I'll simply say.
Yes.
A very invasive moment with him. There's a brief shot of her clicking her red shoes, which I think is one of
like
the best symbolic.
Subtle at all.
No, but like it's stimulating emotionally. Like there's a saddening quality to it, and that's what makes Lynch so good at his job. Is even despite
because that's that kind of that escapism element of it that is kind of heartbreaking as she's kind of being interrogated there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Laura Dern's
really
great in this. Yeah.
Oh, she's so good. Okay, so that is Wild at Heart. That comes out in 1990. Now, because of Lynch and how he transitions to Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me comes out in 1992. We're not going to talk about that here. And of course, there's a show. So the next feature film of his doesn't come out until 1997. That is Lost Highway. What do you think about Lost Highway?
I texted this to you offline that, rewatching David Lynch's films after his passing certainly changes things, right? As one would expect. But rewatching them in the context of movies nowadays, especially 2024, I can't look at Lost Highway and not think of The Substance now. As they're both essentially movies that deal with a literal transformation into what one perceives as the quote unquote better version of him or herself. And that's what happens here. It's there's maybe more reasoning to it that I don't have to get into yet. I think we can maybe transition into that thematic idea as this conversation goes. But I think this makes the film weirdly evocative. It's one that I know wasn't as well received at the time. It's one that people had to sort of rediscover as the years went on, when Lynch would become even more celebrated in the coming years. But this one really did affect me. I think this is one of his scariest films, and I think that mostly comes through in his aesthetic choices. There's a loud, quiet sensibility here, especially with the way that sound editing and mixing is utilized, the way that shadows are utilized, the way that he'll showcase dark hallways only to then have someone walk out, but it's actually the person that we thought was looking at a dark hallway. So there's some really clever editing to make this a really frightening experience. I really like this one. I like this one a lot more now, rewatching it after some years since I saw it for the first time. Really good stuff here, I think.
Yeah, I really like this a lot as well. And this is another one of those where like you can kind of see a pivot point here where, we saw one with Blue Velvet as he started to become the David Lynch we would know him to be. Lost Highway would go on to pivot a little bit further in terms of how heavy the surrealism would get as we would see much more of it. It
would slowly escalate, and then with the next film after this, it would not.
Yeah, they could slowly just start to ramp up a little bit more. But that is the brilliance of Lost Highway, because I really love this film a lot as well. It is maybe the first film of his where I go, okay, I don't know exactly what that's about, but I think it rules. I think it's really, really great. Now, there's obviously a lot going on here in terms of identity and guilt and memory, fragmentation, feeling detached from the world around you, remembering things within the human condition, not necessarily what it actually was. I do find all of that extraordinary here. And you couple that with the filmmaking, and you're right. That the one thing we haven't maybe emphasized enough is the sound design to his films are really, really great. That was one of the more noteworthy elements to Eraserhead. Even when that film came out, it was really well known for its sound design. And that would continue through a lot of Lynch's films, but it's certainly an aggressive element to Lost Highway. I do agree. The cinematography here is fascinating. And I love how this film, again, it it bridges that gap between being this engrossing murder mystery sci-fi thriller and also this psychological study that is, as you would expect with Lynch, that is very surrealist. It's a magic trick how he's able to pull that off, and Lost Highway is no different in that regard. And you couple that with the humanistic emotional underbelly at the core of all of his movies, and that is very brazen here as well. And how these characters kind of come and go is just so fascinating to me throughout all of that. And perhaps that's part of why the film is wonderfully confounding to me, right? Because you spend the first 20-25 minutes with Bill Pullman, and then he just disappears for almost the rest of the movie. And you're like, what is going on here? Now, again,
for reasons that are kind of baffling. This is perhaps the most genre bending David Lynch film, because it's and all of his movies are genre bending to a certain degree, and he's fusing different sensibilities together. But he goes a bit off the deep end at times here. He jumps the shark a few times here, but I think he's got a lot of good control over those irregularities, if you will, that you don't even notice when the film is completely changing gears into a sci-fi movie all of a sudden. It's really well handled, I think.
No, I agree. Like, and that's where the hook of the film is a mystery, and also its genre bending elements, all funneled through surrealism and etherealism is so compelling, because there are elements once Bill Pullman as Fred disappears, right? And we get Pete in lieu of Fred. And also there's this mystery man that just pops in and out of the film randomly throughout the film. And you're like, okay, that character is clearly some sort of nucleus to all of this. What does he mean? But he's also called the Mystery Man. That's not me making up that title. That is how the character is named. He's the Mystery Man.
Robert Blake is credited as the Mystery Man.
Yeah. And so what is his role here? And then you have Patricia Arquette as two characters that obviously look alike, but there are subtle differences to them. What are their roles to this story as well? It's all really, really confounding, because Fred, he, not to get into too many details, although this film came out 30 years ago, but he finds himself in jail, disappears somehow. We don't know how he disappears. He's gone. He vanishes. Someone like Pete somehow takes his place. And that is never explained.
It's not.
And so it's just funny how they're but that's a great hook. From a mystery thrilling perspective, it's like, okay, what happened there? And Lynch tries to go about explaining that, but he never does explicitly. And so when there's that reversal at the end, you're like, okay, this is starting to make sense, kind of,
and then it doesn't.
Not.
Well, this is what makes David Lynch so good, is that he's able to turn the metaphysical into something physical. In some cases, if it's a form of dreamlike wish fulfillment or something like that, that's able to manifest itself into a physical plot point, right? And that's why I compared this movie to The Substance, because it does feel like a moment of Fred sort of envisioning himself as a better version of himself. And that's where Pete comes into play. I feel like if I had any reading on this, it's maybe Fred's skewed depiction of what he thinks masculinity is and should be. There are many instances that seem to suggest that he's not fully in touch with his own masculinity. He can't perform well in bed. And there are different things like that make him seem very insecure about his own manlyhood, if that makes sense. So then someone like Pete comes in who has this perceived toughness to him, this youthful greaser-like manliness to him. And perhaps that's this version of wish fulfillment from Fred to kind of find what he thinks is the better version of the the man he thinks he should be, only to then find out it's not all it's cracked up to be, and then makes a transition back when he starts to recognize that. So that's what makes David Lynch so fascinating. If I had any reading on it, it might be that, but he's able to turn the metaphysical into something physical in so many interesting ways.
No, and you are right. I mean, I have been somewhat sarcastic or facetious with some of my commentary here, because it is a disorienting experience in that regard. But
yeah,
you are right. And I do think there is something here as far as fragmented identity and how we feel detached from the world around us. And that I do think is clear, because you look at the duality between Fred and Pete, and you are right. There is a clear distinction between them, where Fred, as you noted, he's not at all what you would consider to be conventionally masculine, where Pete, there are jokes throughout the film where it's like all he does is have sex with all these beautiful women. He can't, they can't stay away from him long enough. And there are a lot of scenes here where he is engaging with a lot of these women sexually. So it's as if he has
even the detectives following him make a comment about that. It's like
there's lots of jokes about that.
There are a lot of jokes, like you want to have his life? That's what they're saying.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so there is this masculine element to Eddie that you can certainly interpret as this part of Fred that might be there that he struggled to tap into, or maybe it's something that Fred wants to be. I don't know. But the sexuality of it, I do think, is really important, not just because of what we see with Fred at the beginning, but when Fred reappears at the end of the film, when does he appear? Right after Pete climaxes in a sexual encounter.
Yep. Exactly.
That's when he reappears. So I don't think that is accidental at all.
I agree.
Yeah, I think there's very much a lot going on there in terms of Fred and Pete and the unification between those two characters, for sure. But it's all in terms of the execution of this film, it is so out there. It is very, very disorienting, but in a way that I loved. I was fully hooked with the film.
It's a creepy movie too. That scene where he being Fred, first encounters the mystery man at that party, which is maybe one of the most iconic scenes in the movie, one of the most referenced for sure. And he tells him to call his house because I'm at your house right now. Genuinely chilling scene.
Oh, very good. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah. Love that. All right. That's Lost Highway. That's 1997. Let's move on to 1999, a film that I have been salivating to talk about here. The Straight Story. Just talk about The Straight Story.
Oh my gosh, David Lynch, you madman. You absolute madman. You somehow get signed on by the Disney machine, and you still made a David Lynch film that's maybe not perceivably a David Lynch film on first go. Is this maybe Disney's best non-animated movie?
I think so. It's very much in that conversation. If it's not, it is right up there.
Yeah. I think this is proof that David Lynch is and always will be cinema's greatest sentimentalist. We use that word a lot, right? I think this is proof that this has always been the case.
If in 1999, if that was Steven Spielberg's crown, with The Straight Story, Lynch stole it. He took the throne with this film.
This movie's amazing. This is an amazing movie, and I'm so glad we're talking about this one now, because I'm sure we'll talk about it again later on this year when we do our 1999 retrospective. That's our next retrospective on the docket for us. It's one of the best films of this particular year, I think. And many would argue that 1999 is one of the best years for movies in general.
All time, yeah.
Yeah, and if you don't reference this movie in that conversation, then you're doing it wrong, I think. I think it's great. I think it's wonderful. And yet, despite it not seeming Lynchian, you alluded to this earlier in this conversation, what Lynch chooses not to do, what he chooses to do as far as his restraint, is kind of the most Lynchian thing about it. and that gives it a real Lynchian quality and a very observational quality in a way. It's almost like, what if David Lynch made a movie about observing a David Lynch-like landscape, and the beauty that comes within that. It's a beautiful, beautiful movie, and maybe his most celebratory movie about his upbringing from Middle America, because it feels the most Middle America out of any of his movies, and that's very much a reoccurring theme in all of his movies, but it feels most central here, which is absolutely what makes it a David Lynch film.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I noted earlier this is one of his more accessible movies, but he's also talked about how this is his most experimental. And I think when you look at the constraints in which he has to make this film from, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I love the film for that, because it does have that Lynchian humanistic quality. I mean, this is a film with a deep, deep pathos. There's a humanistic underbelly to this film that I absolutely love. From moment to moment, there's a lot of quiet stoicism that's really great. And this isn't a film that is afraid to let images linger or focus on character reactions, which, you know, I love that stuff in general. So despite it being straightforward, I think there's a lot going on here in terms of that meditative process that allows for this to be maybe more hypnotic than you might realize on a first go. And you couple that with the performances here, which are really, really fantastic. I mean, I cannot say enough good things about Richard Farnsworth here. He is so
Heart
good
breaks
in this
for
role.
him. Yeah,
Absolutely devastating. I love how he plays everything so he does it from like this deep emotional place without ever being cathartic. Until maybe you could argue the end of the film gets a little bit. But like, it's incredible how like what's driving him is some sense of grief, some sense of lost time, a little bit of time is running out, and so he wants to make an amend with his brother, and again, just like in this beautiful way, I love the ending of this film because there's an exchange between the two brothers that is almost dialogue-less. There's a few exchanges there, but it's all in the performances. It's in the eyes. Like, it's how David Lynch captures the eyes of the performers there.
Even the dialogue that is there between the two. Yeah, the dialogue that is there between the two of them is not really pertinent to the emotional moment. It's more so like oh, you came in that. You know, it's more practical. But you're right that the emotional connection there is really unspoken in many ways.
Yeah. Just I love how Lyle asks. He says something along the lines of like, "You came all the way to here to see me in that," or whatever he says. And he's like, I did. And that's it. Like, that's as far as the exchange goes. And then they sit there together, reminiscing, looking up at the stars. And again, this is a film that begins, like, its opening credits is of the stars in the night sky. So that symbolism, that foreshadowing had always been there. And for the film to end with them looking up that way, it is absolutely devastating. Like, it is so good. Oh my God.
There are many scenes that are devastating like that. The scene at the bar where, talking about their respective experiences at war, I think is also very devastating stuff. There is something very unconventional about this movie, even if it is somewhat accessible by comparison, which I think that is what makes it perhaps Lynch's most experimental film, is because it is weirdly toned back. Even, by comparison to other live action Disney movies, this feels very mild in a way, because it is once again one of these movies, like one of these types of movies rather, that you and I love, and that's beauty in the mundane. This is all about
this, and a lot of ways,
that is absolutely this. And the way it taps into the idea of getting old, and David Lynch tying these ideas to his own sensibilities at a time when he wasn't even that old just yet. This kind of reminds me of a movie that came out 2 years before The Straight Story. It's a weird comparison because they're nothing alike, but imagine like how it must have felt when Quentin Tarantino made Jackie Brown, which is a movie all about coming to terms with your age. And he did so when he was only in his early 30s, and yet taps into that idea probably better than any filmmaker that may have been in their 70s at that time. David Lynch is kind of doing something similar about legacy and getting old at a time when maybe he was starting to think about that, but he was still a bit, age-wise removed from that idea. He's certainly very far removed from Richard Farnsworth in real life, who I believe would go on to pass away only a few months after this movie came out.
Quickly, yeah.
Yeah, so there is something weirdly meta about tapping into that idea, and maybe that's why it just feels so, it just feels so genuine. This almost feels like it could have been a documentary. It has such a realism to it.
No, I agree. I mean, that idea of lost time and running out of time is such a significant part of the nucleus of this film. And I think that's what's so fascinating and moving to me about this duality we see in Alvin, where he's obviously getting older. In those early scenes, he had fallen over. So there's clearly some sort of health ailment that suggests that he might not live much longer himself. So there is a frailty to him physically, and you juxtapose that to his emotional strength, the resilience that he shows throughout this film, and it goes on to demonstrate the prowess of the human spirit. That no matter how old you get, you can overcome those physical flaws because of what being human means, and the power of emotion, how that drives us very literally in this film, drives us to make these decisions that carry so much weight in our lives. And so I think that's what's so fascinating about, again, this being a simple road trip. The whole plot of this film is Alvin's driving from Iowa to Wisconsin to see his brother on a lawnmower, just driving his way there and having this profound experience as a result. So like that's a dichotomy that I just absolutely love. And David Lynch freaking nails it out of the park. It's so beautiful.
This could have been a director for hire gig. It really could have been. And from what I understand, I don't think he was a co-writer on this movie. It's not like with The Elephant Man where he was brought on to that film, but he does share a co-writing credit on that one. He did make some updates to the script. But here, I don't think he actually has a co-writing credit on this one. So this could have easily, this could have easily fallen into the trappings of a director for hire gig, and it doesn't feel that way. It feels like a different movie for him, but it also doesn't. It still brings on his usual tendencies. A lot of his usual crewmates are still here too. Angela Badalamenti, who scores a lot of David Lynch's films, is also back once again. So it still carries a similar aura in that way. It's amazing how he was able to really get away with the Disney system that probably wouldn't have happened nowadays. This is the 90s after all when this got made. So perhaps it was easier back then. Or they just simply trusted that he was too good of a filmmaker that whatever he would churn out would just be great. And this absolutely was.
Yeah. And the same cinematographer that did Dune and The Elephant Man. So, clearly working with people that he knew really well, and absolutely killed it. I love this film so much. I haven't done my 1999 exercise yet, so I don't know where this ranks for me, but it is a hell of a start to that journey to figure out 1999. I can't wait to do that retrospective later on.
I think it's number one for me. I think it's number one.
You think it's number one out of all the films? Wow.
Well, I'm going to say this out loud now. I need to rewatch and also do first time watches for a lot of films in 1999. I don't know if I share the opinion that 1999 is one of the greatest years for movies.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I'm there yet.
That's a sizzling take, and I don't know if I agree or disagree yet.
Yeah,
that's what people say. 1999 is an
all timer. Yeah, and I think it's a very influential year. Many of the movies that came out that year that are among the most influential movies ever made, none of them I dislike. It's just I was looking at the list thinking like, wow, I think the movies that are my favorites from this year are not necessarily the ones that people acknowledge as heavily. So it might be it just might be more of a me thing than anything else. But I think this is definitely up there for sure, if not my number one. It's my number one right now because it's really the first film I did in this exercise for 1999.
Yeah, I mean, I will say just on a first glance, just kind of browsing through films of 1999, again, I have a lot of homework to do, some films to catch up with. I think I might be with you. I think I might be there with you.
I think it's a significant turning point in cinema. I just don't know if the quality is quite there for me as other years that we've done. I don't think it's quite 2001.
I agree. 2001, I think, is a better year overall.
Nice transition into David Lynch's next film, though, right?
Yeah, where he directed adaptation of 2001: A Space Odyssey. That was his next film.
Well, I meant a movie that came out in 2001, right?
No, in 2001, he had Mulholland Drive.
Yeah.
Which I think when we did that retrospective, actually, I think I have it here. I can pull up. It was like number 6 on that list, I think, for me. If I remember correctly, yes, I have it at number 6.
Yeah, it didn't quite make my top 10. I think I had it at number 11, which I think just goes to show how strong. I know, right? How dare me? Which, again, not really a knock on Mulholland Drive. Just selfishly speaking, I tend to emotionally respond more to films that aren't quite about Hollywood. It's just more of a me thing, I guess. Which is nothing against Mulholland Drive. I actually think as a movie about the depiction of Hollywood, it's among the most fascinating, if not the very best. Because I think there's a lot of interesting layers we can certainly talk about with it. I just tend to gravitate more towards films that are outside that particular landscape. It's just more of a me thing than anything else. But as a movie about the depiction of the desire to move to LA to quote unquote make it, it's one of the more intriguing examples because I never get the sense that David Lynch hates LA or is overly critical about it. I think he actually kind of loves the movies. If anything, it's more so a representation of a distorted mindset one might have about Hollywood and how that then manifests itself into reality, and the studio trickery at hand because of how someone chooses to view it in that way. Like I said earlier in this conversation, David Lynch is very good at taking the internal and the metaphysical and manifesting it into something physical. And in many ways, that is what Mulholland Drive is all about. And it's a very fascinating movie.
No, I agree. I love this film as well. In a lot of other years, this would have been in my top 5 easily. Perhaps in some years, maybe even as my favorite film of its given year. 2001, I maintain will go down as one of, if not the best year of film ever that nobody talks about in that same way.
Yeah.
You know, like I think it
I'm
is
with you.
absolutely up there. Like I think it is crazy that I have this film at number 6, but that's because the films above it, you have The Royal Tenenbaums, In the Mood for Love, you know, The Lord of the Rings. And look, Mulholland Drive is certainly interchangeable with all of that. Like if anyone told me that this was their number 1 or 2, totally get it. Totally get it. I'm a little bit higher on AI and The Royal Tenenbaums and In the Mood for Love, but Same. Mulholland Drive is excellent. I very much do agree. In a lot of ways, this is the quintessential David Lynch film. It's certainly talked about in that way as being his best film, up there with Blue Velvet. And I do agree. I think like in terms of this era of the Lost Era, Mulholland Drive, Inland Empire phase, I do think it is the best of those 3. And I think,
perhaps.
I think in a lot of ways it's because, as we talked about with Blue Velvet, I think this is the film that he has the best grasp on in terms of experimentation and blurring those lines between.
It is his most balanced since Blue Velvet.
It's his most balanced. Exactly. Yeah. And I think that duality between fantasy and reality here is incredibly gripping. It's fantastic. You're talking about how Hollywood is portrayed as this place of illusion where ambition, desire, manipulation all collide, and this ethereal Lynchian kind of way that collides with, fragmentation of identity. That's such a big thing in a lot of his films, but that is very, very cogent in Mulholland Drive as well. And ambition, desire, as I noted, kind of morphing these characters and their self-perception and how that kind of evolves over the course of the film. It's fantastic. It's really, really great. And also like one of his best shot films. Like
I agree with that too.
Cinematography and sound design. I mean, this is from a craft perspective, also just one of his best films from that regard.
No movie looks like this one. And we'll talk about another movie at the end of this conversation that I could say the exact same thing to, maybe even more egregiously. But yeah, no movie looks like Mulholland Drive, which is one of the best things that I could say about it. And it's interesting. This is a film that didn't start out as a film. If I remember correctly, this started out as a spinoff of Twin Peaks.
Yeah, I did.
And then got morphed into its own, I guess, television pilot / television series of sorts, and then became a movie. And you would never have noticed that weird trajectory turning this into a movie. I mean, then again, Lynch's films are not really governed by narrative, linear storytelling. So his films can probably get away with that type of fragmented upbringing that he could just make whatever he wants and it still works. But it's interesting to know that backstory leading up to the film that ended up getting made, and some of the weird coincidences and how it got made. I think that I think if I remember correctly, there was like Naomi Watts and her experience as the the character she plays here. Actually, there's a lot of shared experiences that she has in real life about trying to audition for movies, never quite making it until the right person saw her. And in real life, that person was David Lynch, who fought for her for this movie. And I think he made the right call. I think she's incredible in this movie. It's really good.
No, and that's the irony of this film turning from television series to film, or like some sort of spin-off, however this ended up formulating. And that is the brilliance of David Lynch. Whether some of it was accidental, perhaps some of it was ironic, maybe a lot of it was calculated, but the idea of this film being about Hollywood as an illusion, involving these shadowy figures dictating careers from behind the scenes. There is a lot of irony to that. That is how Hollywood works, even with Mulholland Drive itself and the formulation of this film and coming into existence. Like there's so much of that at play, which just kind of makes Mulholland Drive just one of those fascinating experiments. It's just really great. And yeah, I mean, the performances here are immaculate. The writing of the film is astounding as well. Yeah,
he's nominated for Best Director for this movie.
Yeah, I was just about to say, like, you could, even though I love Blue Velvet, that's probably my favorite Lynch film. I think there is an argument that this is his best directed movie, and maybe it is his best. I don't really know. It's certainly in that conversation for sure. But I do love it. Yeah. Even if it sat at number 6 for me for 2001. And honestly, like in hindsight, I know we haven't done a retrospective because we just did the one a few years ago. I don't know if my list changes all that much.
I don't think it does.
I still have it at 6.
I think if anything, maybe, looking at Lynch's films in totality post passing, as sad as that is to say, there's a good chance maybe it would inch into my top 10, but it wouldn't crack my top 5, given how much I do love my 5 from that year, 2001 specifically. And I know we haven't rounded out this conversation yet. We still have one more film to talk about briefly in Lynch's filmography. But when I look at Lynch's filmography, and just, based on the conversation that we had here, I do still prefer movies like The Elephant Man and Blue Velvet and Eraserhead and The Straight Story over Mulholland Drive. But Mulholland Drive might round out that 5 for me of Lynch's 9 films, not counting any of the Twin Peaks things that he did. I do think you're right that as far as this era of his fusion of experimentation and surrealism with the emotional side of him that maybe came more into fruition with Lost Highway, those 3 films, this is probably the best of the 3. I think that's safe to say.
Yeah, that's where I sit. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as much as I love Lost Highway, then I really, really do love it a lot. But there is something about again, that marriage of directing, writing, performance, and a little bit of the meta qualities within Hollywood, kind of how that manifests here is fascinating to me.
I think what Mulholland Drive has over something like Lost Highway, and I would admit, I think a movie like Lost Highway provokes me more, fascinates me more, but there's something about Naomi Watts' performance in Mulholland Drive and Justin Theroux in that movie as well. It kind of takes me back to what I love so much about Wild at Heart. While I think it might be a messy film, there's conviction in the performances that just bring me into that one in a different way. Lost Highway doesn't quite have that same level of performative conviction. It's not necessarily going for that. So it's not a knock on that film, but it's doing different things where it's more focused on Lynch as the director than it is anything else. And that's maybe what pulls me into Mulholland Drive a little bit more so.
All right. We're running long here, so let's quickly get into the last film we have here. His last feature film in 2006. It's crazy that it all ended in 2006, but Inland Empire is his last film. What do you think about that one?
Huh.
Yep. Yeah. Pretty much narrows it down.
It's almost as if David Lynch called up Laura Dern and simply asked her, do you want to come and do some experimenting? And I'm not kidding. That's apparently exactly how it went down. According to Laura Dern, that is how she got offered this movie. Is David Lynch called her and said, you want to go do some experimenting? That's the movie that we got.
Of course.
I mentioned earlier with Mulholland Drive, no other movie looks like that one. No movie ever made looks like Inland Empire. Nothing looks like this. The closest thing I can think of to maybe compare it to is maybe something like a Lars von Trier movie is maybe the closest thing I can think of.
Sure.
But even then, it doesn't quite have that same cinematic language. It's a very fragmented movie, a very cheap looking movie that runs 3 hours long. At times, it also might be the scariest movie I've ever seen, Inland Empire specifically. There are 2 jump scares in this movie that still send chills down my spine, and they're pretty iconic in this landscape of cinema right now. I don't know what this means. It kind of feels like an evil twin to Mulholland Drive as far as its depiction of Hollywood and the immersion of it. In a way, I think it almost feels like a critique on method acting. Is maybe the one thing I almost took from it.
Okay.
But honestly, I don't know what this movie means. I am so baffled by it, but I'm so happy it exists as just a sheer form of David Lynch saying, what can I get away with? What can I get away with here?
Yeah. I think calling this the evil twin to Mulholland Drive is pretty apt. I think my favorite thing about Inland Empire is that the first half of the movie is a typical David Lynch film in the sense that there's a fascinating hook, a mystery that's as baffling as it is entrancing, implementing his patented surrealism.
Yeah.
It is all par for the course for the first 90 minutes of the film. If you didn't know how this film ended and you're just into the first 30 minutes of the film, you're like, this is just like any other David Lynch film. I love the hook here. There's a little bit of mystery. What's going on? It all is pretty cogent as far as David Lynch goes. And then at the halfway mark, completely out of the velvet blue, all of a sudden the film shifts to pure experimentation and stream of consciousness.
This is chaos. This movie's
David
chaos.
Lynch fully giving into his artistic ambitions, not knowing where any of this was going to go. And I don't know if this is true. Maybe it is based off of what you were just saying there about Laura Dern's explanation of what this film is or how it came about. But I fully believe that David Lynch and Laura Dern, when they got to the stream of consciousness element of this film, they just completely made it up as they went along.
Oh, this is a movie all about improvisation, filmmaking improvisation. In fact,
it is
Laura Dern's character here, and she kind of plays 2 characters that morph into each other in a weird way. So there is almost like this Ingmar Bergman persona effect happening here. But at one point she says, and feel free to bleep me out if you need to, because it does involve that dreaded curse word. She says, I don't know what happened first, and it's kind of laid a mind on me. And it's like, you said it, Laura Dern. You absolutely said it. You just described this movie in a mere 30 seconds, and it took 3 hours to do it, which I'm okay with because I actually enjoyed this movie more now in this context than I did before. But I really appreciate this form as just a sheer form of experimentation, surreal experimentation.
Yeah, no, it is the pure definition of experimentation. It is a stream of consciousness, and that's all it is. It is about trying to denote one's existential crisis, just a pure lack of identity, and being completely lost with the world around you. That is a very vanilla way to describe this film because it is much more wild than that, but that's the only thing I can give to it at this point. Because the back half of this film, I cannot begin to articulate. It is it is just paranoia and dread done through cinema. That's the only way you can explain it.
And then all of a sudden it involves a group of Polish people, I think. And somehow they get involved in the plot.
To a Polish film. Yeah, it's insane. It's absolutely wild. So I mean, it is a fascinating film in that regard. I was completely engaged with it, but I could not begin to, there's not a lucid bone in the back half of this film, which is why it is interesting for sure. It's all really, really compelling, but couldn't begin to tell you what it's about.
I did like it more in this rewatch, like I said, but I will say of the 9 films we just talked about, if I were to do like a very brief attempt at ranking these, this would be just above Dune at maybe at number 8 for me. So I think Inland Empire and Dune, that's where you have it. But the rest are kind of all tied for first place in their own respective. I mean, they're not, but I'm trying to be nice and say like how great all these films are in their own individual ways. But yeah, they all have varying things about them that just it's sad to say this because it comes off the heels of David Lynch's passing, but I'm really starting to recognize just how he may have been one of the greatest of all time. He was one of the greatest of all time, and I think we certainly knew that. We certainly already knew that and acknowledged that, but now I'm really sensing it even more. And it's an astounding legacy he's leaving behind.
I agree. I mean, I really, really like all of these films to one degree or another. Even Dune, I liked a lot of the first half of that film. I think it really just falls apart when it tries to become Dune Part 2 in 30 minutes. At the end, which you can't do. You can't do, but I still think there's some really fascinating elements to his Dune that I really do like a lot. And then, all the films above it, to your point, are very much battling for that first spot. They're all fantastic. So, there's just no one like him. I mean, the fascinating thing about Lynch, and we've said it 1,000 times already, but you can watch him, label him as the artistic, surrealistic, pretentious filmmaker, if that's the word that you want to use. Like, he was very much all about invoking interpretation. But underneath all of that, when you peel away the facade of what's on the surface, is cinema's most sentimental filmmaker, storyteller. Like he was a deeply human, emotional storyteller. Yeah, and I love that about his films. Like
I agree.
There's a rich empathy to every one of them that is fascinating. I love that duality, and I will deeply miss him.
So I guess next up, JD, bonus content, Twin Peaks.
Yeah, we got to do Twin Peaks at some point. I got to find the time. I don't know when I'm going to find the time, but I got to find the time.
There's a lot of material there. And like I said, I have started watching Twin Peaks. I haven't seen it before. I'm a few episodes into season 1, and I am hooked. I'm hooked in the same way that I was with Blue Velvet. It has a very similar film noir kind of hook in many ways. It's very engaging so far.
All right, well, we've gone really long here, so we're going to go ahead and end the show here. Let us know if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say. Leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. You can always email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com. Be on the lookout. We do have 2 reviews this week. We're going to be talking about Ke Huy Quan and his latest film, Love Hurts, and the horror comedy film, Hard Eyes. We'll have reviews of both of those. And as I noted earlier up at the top of the show, we might have bonus content this week if we decided to do trailer talk with all the Super Bowl trailers, or we'll push that to next week's show, whatever we land on. But be on the lookout for all of that. There'll be a new Chasing the Gold, Shadon and Company. They will also talk about more of the aftermath of CCA, DGA, PGA, all of that sort of stuff. So you can be on the lookout for that. New Women in Session out this week as well. So very, very busy week, plus lots of reviews. There's lots of Sundance coverage.
True. You
missed all of that. We have lots of Sundance coverage over at InSessionFilm.com as well. With that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the InSession Film Podcast. Oh, David Lynch.
Rest in peace, David Lynch.